Hello and welcome to part 5 of this Victoria 2 tutorial series. Now, I've already wasted several hours trying to make this video, and all that footage has been scrapped and I'm starting over. This is one of the several reasons I hadn't already made this video. But anyway, as an aside before we get into the video itself, I have to tell you I don't record with a script. And usually when I'm recording something by myself, I'll record segments over and over until I get it right, or at least until I think I get it right. And then I'll move on to the next segment. Well, that's not really possible in this video because a lot of what I'm showing is stuff happening in real time. So there's going to be parts where I misspeak, there's going to be parts where I forget something, there's going to be parts where I have a random callback to something I talked about a long time ago, and unfortunately it's really hard to edit that sort of thing with any continuity in the video. So what I'm saying is this video is going to be a bit lower quality than the other ones, and I'm sorry, you're just going to have to live with it. I don't like it, you might not like it, but that's just the way it is. I'm going to try and clear up everything I can in the editing, but it's not going to be perfect, and it might not be pretty in some areas, so this is your word of warning. The reason this video is relatively difficult to edit is that for much of the video I'm actually playing a multiplayer game with two computers that are sitting in front of me. On this one I'm going to be recording, and I'm going to be using the other computer to move troops around in ways that the AI is just not going to be able to do. Now, for most of these demonstrations, I'm going to be using a scenario based on an actual multiplayer campaign, and that's the Japan campaign that I uploaded a while ago. Now, something I want to point out is there's a reason that 30k stacks are the standard in Victoria 2. And as a reminder from the last video, the reason why is because if we have either 10% of the units being reconnaissance units, or 10% of the units being siege units, then we get that reconnaissance bonus or the siege bonus. You notice that almost none of these units are 30k stacks, but all of them have reconnaissance units and siege units. So none of them are getting the bonuses of reconnaissance or siege, which completely defeats the purpose of using reconnaissance and siege units. So I spent about 45 minutes going through in multiplayer and fixing the armies for both sides. So on the French side, we're going to be using Guerin stacks, which is 1 Dragoon, 4 Infantry, 4 Artillery, with the Engineer variant. And on the NGF side, we're going to be using standard Hussar stacks with the Engineer variant. That's 1 Hussar, 4 Infantry, 4 Artillery, 1 Engineer. In the next video, we'll be looking at strategies, but in this video, we'll be focusing on troop movements, combat, and unit level tactics. So if you want to think of it this way, in the next video, we'll be looking at why you do things, but in this video, we'll be looking at how you do things. And of course, there's some overlap as well. Now, before we continue, let's consider what we're trying to do with our armies at any given stage of the game. So as a country, you have a military, and your military has two purposes. Number 1, to defend yourself, and number 2, to project power outward for whatever purposes you might have. So to that end, we want to make sure that our military is the most effective military we can possibly have. If you think you're going to be entering war soon, there are at least 4 things you need to do. Number 1, go into the budget tab and make sure that your military spending is cranked up to 100%. Unlike EU4, Victoria 2 is not going to hold your hand. If you get declared on, it's not going to turn up to 100% for you. So absolutely make sure this is cranked up. And it's also a good idea to turn up your military spending and set your national focuses on your most populous states to soldiers. And that's because for any losses that you take, you're going to need to replenish them. And if you can't support the pop that's being depleted, then that soldier is going to vanish. So you want to make sure that you're always replenishing in your most populous states, so set these to soldiers. Now, something else you'll notice if we run the clock for a day here, if we mouse over the military spending, we'll see whether we're able to satisfy the purchases necessary to supply our military to 100%. You can see some of these numbers are in red, meaning we're not getting those supplies, some of them are in green. And you'll notice that artillery is 0 out of 17. You may recall from the last video there's something called the poor man's artillery method, and that's exactly what I was doing in this case. This was a save taken from a multiplayer game. That is, I had my spending at 50%, so I was saving half the money on my military spending, but you'll notice that if you look at the pop-up window on the far right, the artillery cost is more than double all the other costs combined. So because of that, I wanted to make sure I wasn't buying artillery except when I needed to. So if you're not getting the resources that you need, and if those resources are available, and if you want to have the most effective military possible, then you want to make sure that you're actually getting those resources. So remember, if you're using the poor man's artillery technique, having artillery versus not having artillery is always preferable, and that's whether or not you have the artillery fully supplied. So simply having artillery in your unit with no artillery supplied to it is good. Having artillery in your unit fully supplied is way better. So if you can afford it, go to your trade window, make sure that you're getting all the supplies you need. I have my artillery spending set to 0, so I'll just go in. If I want to, I can automate it, which will automatically set it to the level necessary, or I can go in and set my spending to some arbitrary level. I can max it out, or I can set it well above what's needed. So in this case, we needed 17 artillery, so really anything above 17 would work, but might set this to like 100 or so. So not going to bankrupt myself, but this cost is going to accrue over time. So, you know, if we were to run the clock, I'd be losing a lot of money, but losing money is better than losing a war. Next thing you'll need to consider is whether or not you're going to mobilize. And I've talked about how to mobilize in the last video. In this video, we're just going to assume that all stacks are equal, but you can see in this stage of the campaign, I was actually in the process of mobilizing, and you'll see that here on the mainland, I've got 30k stacks. These are standard stacks without engineers. But here on the islands of Japan, I'm basically using this as a sorting center. So as I'm mobilizing, all those units are converging on Nagata, and from Nagata, they're being partitioned out into standard 30k stacks, and then from there they can be moved as needed. But just remember, the AI will only mobilize after it's in war. You as a player have the option to mobilize before going to war, and you can mobilize at any time. It takes time, so if you need those mobilized troops, and if you want to use those mobilized troops, start mobilizing well in advance. A couple of other things about mobilization. One I've already mentioned. Make sure you go into your message settings, search for mobilization, and make sure you get a pop-up anytime a nation mobilizes or demobilizes. And that's especially critical in multiplayer, because if you see everyone around you that is hostile to you is mobilizing, it means you better be pressing that mobilization button yourself, cranking up your spending and getting ready for war. Something's about to go down. But really, that's all I'm going to say about mobilization right now. And we'll talk about this more when we get to the strategies and why you would mobilize at certain times. For the purposes of this video, we're just going to assume that all stacks are standard 30k stacks. And indeed, as I mentioned, I've already reorganized the armies of NGF and France for that purpose. The third thing you'll need to consider is troop placement. We're going to talk about that later. The fourth thing you'll need to consider is the location of your generals. And we'll also talk about this a bit more later, but just be aware of where your good generals are. And we'll talk about how you can move them around and get them where they need to be later on in this video. So let's move over to France and get to some actual examples. Alright, so I've loaded up as France. Had a bit of a recording issue there, so let's go over this part again just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Basically, we've got, I think, 13 standard 30k stacks here. These are all Gurren stacks, as I mentioned, with a Dragoon. On the German side, we've got, I think, 11 standard stacks with Hussars. There is another war taking place right now, thanks to the AI. That's Italy versus Austria-Hungary, but because the UK and Japan are in it, there is the potential for some shortages. However, having checked just now, both France and NGF are getting all of their military supplies, so there's no real problem there. On each side, there's some other unsorted units, but we'll just ignore those. The most important thing are the mechanics of the battles themselves. So to start this demonstration off, I've moved this unit from Saarbrücken onto Metz to start a battle. The battle started on the 4th, which is today. There's this indicator in the top left corner saying it's impossible to retreat right now. So after the first day of battle, you're going to be stuck in battle for at least 11 days. During that time, you can move more troops in, but you can't move any troops out. Let's look at some of the other things taking place in this battle. If you mouse over the flags, you'll see the military tactics for each side as well as the army tech. You'll see that in this particular campaign, at this stage of the game, both NGF and France had their army tech maxed out at 15 out of 30. They both have the same level of military tactics, and the generals are actually pretty comparable with each other. On the one side, we've got a 3.5 attack general, we've got a 3 defense general. Of course, we're going to get some variance in the dice rolls, and the higher your dice roll, the more damage you have the potential to do. But we can't really control for that, so let's move on. One thing you'll notice here is that the defense has a terrain penalty of 1. And let's look at that right now. If you mouse over the terrain in the background, it doesn't really give you any information aside from the effect on combat width, which we'll also talk about in a moment. But if you click on a province and then mouse over the terrain in the background and hold your mouse there, you'll get this extra information that pops up. So movement cost and supply limit we're not too concerned with. The important things here are that defense bonus and the combat width modifier. Different types of terrain will have different bonuses for different things, but the important things to keep in mind are woods, hills, and marshes, which I don't know if there's a marsh in this area, but I know there's some over in Ukraine, and marshes have a 1 defense bonus. Mountains have a 2 defense bonus, which basically means that if you're getting attacked in any of these areas, you're going to have a -1 or a -2 to the attacking side, which is going to help the defense. Also, as mentioned, in the case of woods, we have combat width reduced by 20%. Remember that if we look at the technology window, the army tab, and then we go down light armament, here the second column, this is where we get our combat width reductions. So for this stage of the game, and this does vary by mod, so check your mod, but for this stage of the game in this mod, we've got a combat width reduction of 5 total. So the maximum we can have if we were to fill this all the way out would be 30. Drop that by 5, it becomes 25. But because we're in the woods, it drops by an additional 20%, so 25 drops to 20. And this is why we see 20 spaces across that can be filled in. Now let's let this battle play out here at speed 1, and then we'll talk about it as we go through. So there's a bit of a dig-in penalty now from the defense. And you see in this case, the attackers got just completely demolished. The attackers have lost 26k troops, the defense has lost 7k. Now if we were to play this battle out 100 times, every single time would be different. In some cases it'd be a lot more even. In some cases the attack might win just right off the bat because of a 9 roll. In some cases the defense is going to completely destroy the offense. You can see in this case it's still an additional day before this unit can even retreat. And before we move on, the thing I want to point out is that with all other things being equal, combat always favors the defense. And the reason why is that if there's a terrain penalty, it only hurts the attacker. If you're dug in, it only hurts the attacker. If a unit is standing on home territory with a fort, and if that fort is in effect, that only helps the defender. So once combat begins, with all other things being equal, everything favors the defense. So then you might ask yourself, does the offense have anything going for it at all? And the answer to that is yes. The defense has the mechanics of combat in its favor. The offense can choose where combat will take place, and can also determine how many units are going to enter combat. So let's just let this battle play out real quick, and we'll watch the attacking side is just going to get stack wiped. So the attacking side lost all of its troops, the defense lost about 25%. Let's get this unit out of here real quick. But as we're going to move it, we'll see we're on the 25th of September, so watch what happens as the month ticks over. We got 22k here right now, almost 23k. So the month ticked over. This was a standard 30k stack when we started. It lost 25% of its strength, and now over the course of just a week, it's back to almost full strength. Now if we go back to the technology window, we call that culture on the far right. This is where we get our reinforcement speeds. So having this maxed out will greatly help you, because the quicker you can reinforce your troops, the quicker you can get your depleted stacks back up to full strength. If you select a unit, you'll notice that every single brigade and the unit itself has 2 bars. The bar on the far right represents the strength of the unit, that is, how many men out of 3,000 does each brigade have, and how many men out of the potential total does the unit itself have. On the left we see the organization. You'll notice that those units that were on the front line, that is the infantry and the dragoon, have lower organization. The ones that were in the back line and not taking damage have almost all of their organization left intact. If we mouse over the organization bar, we can see that for the unit as a whole it's at 50, and it's going to be increasing at 0.466, so it's going to take several months for these units to get back up to full organization. Now units can fight if they're not at full organization, but they're going to get depleted faster, and they're going to get knocked out of battle faster if you send these in. So it's a good idea once a unit has been in battle to give it at least a few months before you throw it back in. And this is also why if you're preparing to go to war, you want to make sure that your military spending is at maximum for at least several months before you go to war, because it takes time for that organization to tick up. So we're going to send a fresh unit to the front, and we're going to pull in some extra German troops. And there was something I forgot to mention, so let's just go ahead and start a new battle. We're going to once again move 1 German stack onto this French stack. Alright, so combat has started, and you can see from the numbers this one is starting out fairly evenly. We've got a 7 roll versus a 7 roll. We've got actually a defensive general leading the attack, so there's no bonus there. We've got an attack general on the defense, so there's no bonus there either. So really these are two terrible generals, but again, we're going to talk about generals more later. What you should be looking at here is that this is a fairly even battle. And as you'll notice, when this battle starts out, again, we're starting with modular stacks of 10 brigades. We've got our frontline units on the front line. We've got our backline units, our artillery and engineer in the back line. And it looks like a really nice composition as we're starting this battle. But let's see what happens as this battle progresses. So again, things are still fairly even right now. Alright, this is a good time to pause. So you can see on the German side, their units are becoming discolored on the front. And if we mouse over them, we can see that the organization is fairly low. The maximum is 65, and these are down around 10%. So these units are hurting badly. On the French side, we can see our units are down around 15%. A couple of things to point out here. So you'll notice that on both sides, we've got 2 units on each side that are very low organization, and then we've got 1 unit right in the middle that has approximately half of its organization on both sides. And why is that? Well, you'll notice that the ones that are depleted are in front of the artillery. And on both sides we've got 4 artillery off to the side, and the frontline units on the opposite side are hurting badly. Artillery are most effective from the back line, and they impact the unit directly across. In contrast, the engineer hardly does anything at all. So if you have engineers, you're not going to be doing as much damage to that frontline unit on the other side. So this is why you as a player have to decide if it's worth having that extra engineer and taking a space of something that would otherwise be an artillery, versus just having that extra firepower in the back line. And this might depend on the stage of the game, because remember, the purpose of the engineer is to counteract the fort level, and if you have low level forts early on in the game, it's not quite so critical. If you have high level forts later on in the game, it might be more worthwhile, but that's something that you're going to have to consider on your own. Alright, so let's continue here. Alright. So at this point you see the German line has started to fall apart. We've got units in the front line with 0 organization, and once a unit reaches 0 organization, it gets removed from the battle. As units get removed from the battle, the units that are behind them, in this case our artillery, move forward. So let's run it for one more day. The infantry that was here at 0 org was removed, and this artillery has moved up. On the defending side, we've lost 1 frontline unit, and this artillery has moved up. This one's still at 0, and it's just chilling there for probably one more day. It's going to get removed. Alright, so we see that unit has been removed from battle, and on the defending side we also have more artillery in the front line, as these units have been moved up as well. So at this point we've got very disorganized stacks. We've got backline artillery units on both sides exposed on the front. We've only got 1 artillery unit that's actually behind something, and that's on the defending side. On both sides we've got engineers being mostly useless in the background, and then we've got 1 frontline infantry unit, and that's thanks to not being bombarded by artillery on the opposing side. So at this point, our damage is going to be reduced substantially if we look at the numbers. So you notice the damage there was a lot lower than when we started, and that's not only because we have fewer troops in the battle, but also because they're not in optimum position as they were when we started the battle. So our damage is going to be way, way lower than it was when we started. Let's get these guys out of battle. And now's a good time to point out that if you're in battle, and you'll notice that the indicator is gone because it's been well over 12 days, at this point you can highlight your units, and if you were to right click on a province, you will then move to that province and retreat from the battle. Obviously if you're the one retreating, you lose the battle, and depending on the extent of the losses versus the size of your military, you'll get some amount of war exhaustion. You can see that the NGF lost half again as many troops as the French, and you'll notice here that given that these armies are fairly equivalent in size, that NGF has half again as much war exhaustion as a result of the battle as the French. You'll notice that NGF gets prestige. France has lost the same amount of prestige in this case. We'll get back to this a little bit later, but right now I just want to move these units out of combat. So let's get a fresh unit in, and we'll get some units queued up on the NGF side as well. Alright, so we saw what happened when evenly matched units came up against each other in combat, but let's see what happens if we double the amount of troops on the attacking side. Alright, so combat has started, and we have terrible dice rolls. On one side we've got an effective 3, on the other side we've got an effective 0, and as you saw from the very first day, the defending side took about 3 times as many losses as the attackers. But really the more important thing here is watch what happens with the individual stacks. You'll notice that the defending side, this stack looked exactly like it did when we started the last battle, but the attacking side is now substantially different. Every single backline unit when we started the last battle had a frontline unit in front of it. You notice this time our stacks are a little bit more disorganized, so we've actually got a frontline artillery starting the battle. We've got what should probably be its frontline unit way off here to the side in the back line. But let's just go ahead and continue this battle for a bit. So we moved the clock one day. Our frontline artillery has moved back. Our cavalry, which is off to the side, has moved inward to take its place. And our backline infantry has moved forward. So one take home here is that reorganizations can take place during a battle itself. But let's go ahead and continue the clock. Notice these units are now shifting around on the outside because they're not actually engaged in the battle, as there's no one in front of them that they're fighting, so they're really just trying to move in and get to a more convenient location to do some damage. Alright, let's continue. Alright, so the attack is going fantastically in this case. You see now it's turned around, the defense is doing some damage. You'll notice also here that because we have 2 stacks that we're attacking, and there were 2 engineers in those 2 stacks, those 2 engineers are in the center of the combat. The problem here is that these engineers are not as effective at doing damage as the artillery in the back row. So actually, on the defending side, we have 1 engineer that's being relatively ineffective against 1 unit on the other side. But on the attacking side, we've got 2 engineers that are being ineffective against 2 frontline units on the defending side. So you would expect to see that these units in the center across from the engineers on the other side are going to last a lot longer than they would otherwise. Let's go ahead and run the clock. Right. So again, where we've got artillery on the defending side, the units opposing them are taking heavy damage. Remember, artillery in general are more effective on the defense than the offense anyway, which is yet another way that combat favors the defense. But we can see that these units are reorganizing on the attacking side to fill in the gaps as we go along. So in this case, we actually had a stack wipe where the defense was destroyed. And you notice that we had plenty of men on the defense. It didn't matter, and the whole unit got wiped. So in this case, the defense has lost 30k troops, and the attacking side has lost 14k. Now again, this was just the outcome of one particular battle, and if we were to play this 100 times, we'd have 100 different outcomes, but you can hopefully see the benefits of having more units on the attacking side as you go into battle. That is, as your units get depleted, your other units on the side can move in to replace them, and as you replace, you're able to continue doing damage to the defenders, and if you're able to lower their organization quickly enough, then you can potentially wipe out entire stacks that still have men left in them. Okay, a few other things to point out here. Let's get most of these units back to the German side. We got 4k versus 62. So unlike EU4, entering combat with over 10 times the number of attackers does not instantly result in a stack wipe. However, because you have the potential to be doing so much more damage, it's very likely to result in a stack wipe once combat ends. Let's go ahead and run the clock. Let's see if we can't very quickly get one more German unit in here for the sake of demonstration. This might be over before it starts. Alright, 6th of December. Alright, so that unit is in. Now, so there are 3 more days before either side can retreat. 1 more day. Alright, so at this point, the Germans can retreat. And you'll notice that we've got 60k attackers versus 4k defenders. Let's go ahead and pull these Germans out. And you'll notice that it was not a stack wipe. These units are still intact. So having over 10 times the number of defenders does not automatically result in a stack wipe, whether you're just starting the battle or whether it's after the battle has concluded. So you have to fully deplete units in order to get rid of them. So considering this, number 1, how do you prevent from becoming depleted? And number 2, how do you fully deplete the enemy? So now we get to perhaps the single most important tactical concept in Victoria 2, which is the concept of unit cycling. Alright, so we got some fresh troops to the front on each side. Now, as I mentioned, in general, combat favors the defense. We also saw in that last demonstration that you can lose battles. So you're not guaranteed to win just because you're the defender. So as a defender, if you're under attack, you have to ask yourself, do I want to keep this battle going? Will the circumstances be in my favor or turn in my favor if this battle keeps going? There are also some other reasons you might keep a battle going, but that's the main consideration. As an attacker, you choose when to attack, but once the attack is started, you've lost the initiative, so the question becomes, do I keep this battle going in order to try and win and push through, or do I retreat and try somewhere else? Well, if the answer to those is yes on both sides, then that means you're going to be pulling in additional troops. So let's go ahead and move in 60k troops on the German side. Show sort of the mechanics of a real-life battle. Alright. So these units are in on the 23rd. Combat has started. We can see that the defense is taking heavy losses, over twice what the attackers are taking. But we've got all these extra units here, and we're going to ignore the line. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in some extra troops here. So we've got 60k attackers, 30k defenders. Let's make that 90k defenders, and let's actually throw in some additional German troops as well. Alright, so this is for all the marbles. We're throwing in lots and lots of troops into this battle, right? Let's watch this play out. So we can see there's additional 8 days before either side can retreat, and there's nothing we can do at this point except throw in more troops. That's the only thing we can do at this point. So as we saw last time, if our organization drops to 0, these units get stack wiped. Getting stack wiped means we have to spend all those resources to rebuild the units, assuming we've got enough manpower to support the unit, and we have to wait months or even years to build the units. So getting stack wiped is the absolute worst thing that can happen to you. If your army gets destroyed, it's effectively out for, in some cases, the remainder of the war. And that's especially true if you're a low-ranking nation and you're not able to get the resources you need to build up new units. So getting stack wiped is not something we want to happen under any circumstances. So we're going to pull in some extra troops here to keep this battle going. You can see here we still need 2 more days before either side can retreat. Alright. So at this point, again, battle is still very much against the defenders, but let's just assume at this point there are no additional troops here on the attacking side. This is every single attacking troop that the attackers have. Now, if we want to, we can pull in every single one of these troops and have just one giant battle, right? But you'll also notice that if we look at the battle, we can see on the front line, we've got some very, very depleted French troops, and we've got a fairly intact German line. Well, these depleted French troops, especially the artillery on the front line, are not being very effective, right? Well, what can we do about this? We could leave them in until they lose all their organization and all their strength, but what if we just move those units out of battle? So what we can do, we can highlight all of our units. We can deselect the ones that we want to keep in battle for whatever reason. See, this one's at about half strength, so that one's pretty weak. Let's go ahead and move him out. We've got 3 units selected out of our initial 5. You can see they're very depleted, they're low organization, and we're just going to right-click to move those units out of battle. You can see what happens here. So all the units that were on the front, those are the ones that were depleted, just got pulled out of battle instantly. All the ones that are left were the ones that were moved in afterwards. They're not in any sort of optimal positioning at this point, but at least they're full strength. So what we can do at this point is we've got other units here on the side, we can move some of those in. Let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so it's the 3rd of January, we just moved these units out. See, we're going to take some losses because we've got all these unorganized troops, but we're moving in extra troops. So as these troops move in, we're going to get some reorganizations, and dice rolls notwithstanding. You know, you can get 9 rolled by anyone, but you know, 9 rolls are just unfortunate if it happens to you. But what we're doing here is we're cycling our troops, we're pulling out the depleted ones, moving in fresh ones in order to keep this battle going for as long as we can. And just so happens Hindenburg is kicking our ass, but that's basically how you do it. So let's continue to run the clock a bit and move in some more troops. Hindenburg is really doing a number on us here. Alright, so this might actually be a really good example because it's like a last stand. So Germany was kicking our ass. We're taking heavy losses. You can see these 2 units are now completely depleted. We'll pull them out. And you can see that as we pull them out, our organization indicator has shot way up, and that's because of the units that are left, our organization is higher. So NGF's organization is only falling, but ours is replenishing because we're moving those fresh units in and pulling out the ones that are depleted. Now let's run the clock some more. You can see at this point battle is starting to turn around, and now for the first time we're actually doing more damage to the attackers than they're doing to us. And even though the attackers have a 10 roll versus our 11, because they are now disorganized and we have something resembling a functioning army, we're doing more damage. That's not quite the full story when it comes to reorganizing stacks. So let's pull some more units out because we want to keep this battle going. Alright, so fairly even right now, and it's the 18th of January. We need to move in some extra German troops, unfortunately, so let me get those moving. Alright, so as cycling is taking place, obviously the enemy can cycle as well. So we got some 60k German troops coming in. We're going to be pulling out some of the German troops that are on their side, so they too will be cycling. So once this 60k comes in, we'll have 2 stacks moving out on the German side. So the units are in, and we're going to pull out the 60k German troops. So you can see those moving out here. You can see now the German front is a little bit disorganized as a result. Alright, so Germans outnumber us 3-1 in this battle. Looks like all is lost, right? We've got some very depleted stacks here. Watch what happens when the month takes over. We got 53k here. 4 more days. So our 53k just became 134k. And as we've been waiting, these units have been regaining their organization as well. Again, it takes several months to fully replenish, but having something is better than nothing at all. So what we could do at this point is select those troops that we want to move back into the battle. Let's say these 2. Select and move them back in, like so. So now we've got a 70k versus their 80k. And again, the rolls are going to have a massive impact, but as we continue, we'll move out the depleted troops and move in fresh troops as needed. That's the general idea of unit cycling. You can keep individual battles going for months or even years. Individual battles can have losses numbering in the millions, and that really just depends on how many troops you're willing to commit and how many troops your enemy is willing to commit, and if you can cycle effectively. A few things to point out here when it comes to unit cycling. Obviously, you want to minimize your losses from attrition. So in general, if you have very depleted troops, for example this 6k stack, you want to move him further back because you don't want to have all your units standing in one place. So something I like to do is those units that are the healthiest, I keep those closest to the front, and then as we move back we drop a few units here and there. So basically the units that are going to be ready to move back into battle the soonest are the closest to the front, and those that are going to take longer to replenish, those are going to be further back. And obviously we can move units from the back to the front like so. I'll just keep this going. Got another 30k here ready to move in, so go ahead and move that in. Alright, so there you go, that's the concept of unit cycling. Now if we look at the generals here, you'll notice that we've got a 2 defense general, and as you might recall, we have some better generals in our army. And if we look at all the different generals that are here, it doesn't look like we have a better defensive general in this stack right now. But this is one reason why you need to know where your good generals are, because you want to keep your high level high defense or attack generals as needed in battle. So here we have Ferdinand Foch. Although this is a depleted unit, I might just go ahead and keep this unit in the battle, because having that general in the battle is more important than letting this unit recover. But if it's single player, and if you are willing to micromanage like crazy, what you can actually do is just separate this unit out. So let's say we want to have this particular general, which is a great general, and we're just going to attach him. Let's say we'll put him on a bunch of artillery, because artillery tend to last in battle longer than other units. So we're going to move this unit into battle with nothing but artillery. We're actually splitting this stack, and once this general comes into battle, he's going to take over. So we've got Foch leading the defense with 4 defense, and we now have a more effective general leading the battle, so we're going to be doing more damage to the attackers in this case. So know where your good generals are, and make sure you keep your good generals in the battles. Something else to keep in mind, which I don't know if I have a good example of it here, but just because you have a good attack or defense general doesn't necessarily mean that general is going to be leading the battle. So let's say, for the sake of argument, and it's not happening here, but we'll just pretend. Let's say that Foch wasn't leading the battle. He's in the battle, but he's not actually leading it. Let's say that this Thomas de whatever, let's say he's leading the battle because he's a really good attack general. And this will sometimes happen. You might have a god tier attack general leading the defense, even though you've got a defensive general that's better than your attacking general. So what you can do in this case, you can take this stack, move him out, go into the military tab, uncheck auto assign leaders. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to take that general off the stack and move that stack back into battle. So we've got Tomas here. We're going to select it and put no leader. And we are going to be losing a bit of prestige as we move generals around, but losing some prestige is preferable to losing battles and losing wars. So if this is happening to you, just go ahead and click OK and just ignore it. We're going to send this unit back into battle with no general. And again, the purpose here is to have the units in play, but not have the general in play, because we want to make sure that the general that we want leading the battle is actually leading the battle. This is especially critical if you have allies with you in a battle, because the general that leads the battle is not necessarily the best general. And also notice that the military tactics and the army tech that is applied to the entire army is based on the leader of that particular side. So as an example, if Spain were in this war as an ally of France, and if they moved one of their units in here, and if they had garbage tier tech and a really good general, they could take over this battle and cripple the French side simply because they have a good general in battle. And this is something to watch out for, especially in multiplayer games, because as you have multiple people on a side all taking part in the same battle, you might have someone leading the battle that you don't want leading the battle. So just be aware of that. Okay, that's the general idea behind unit cycling and how you can keep battles going when they're in your favor. Now before we move on, there's one last caveat we have to talk about when it comes to unit cycling. It's a rare situation, but if it happens, it can completely turn the tide of war against you. Here's how it works. So we saw previously that the combat width in Metz was 20. So it's 25 thanks to tech, minus 20%, so 25 becomes 20. So 20 brigades wide, times 2 is 40 brigades total. That's the maximum number we can have on either side, right? So 40 brigades, each brigade is 3,000 troops. So that's 120,000 troops total, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have just a massive number of troops in the battle on each side. So this will be 120k, that's 150. Let's say 180. Let's make it 210. So 210,000 troops on each side just for good measure. We're going to move some extra troops in from behind, and on the German side we're just going to throw in pretty much everything. Let's get the clock going and we'll start this battle up. We've got all these units converging on Metz. Alright, and let's go ahead and move in all the German troops. Here they go. So you can see that on both sides we've got a full front row and a full back row, and as I mentioned, we're seeing the same issue here with the engineers on the attacking side. That is, they're going to be doing a lot less damage to the front row on the defending side versus the artillery here, but anyway, that's not what we're looking at. The main thing we're looking at is that we've got a full front row and a full back row, and it's going to be 11 additional days before either side can retreat, so we're just going to run the clock for a little bit. In the meantime, we'll continue moving up these extra troops. So each side is taking losses. Not too concerned with the losses right now, except that I want to keep this battle going. Alright, 6 more days. 5, 4, etc. Alright, what I'm going to do is let some of these units cycle out real quick. Okay. Alright, so we can see that of our units, this one is the most depleted with only 17k left, right? And if we pull that unit out, we see we've got some gaps on the front especially, and that's where our low organization troops are. And if we run the clock, again, these get filled in. We've already seen this. But what I'm going to show you is what happens if you move in a lot of extra troops and then pull out a lot of troops simultaneously. So I've combined these 3 stacks into one approximately 90k stack. Let's go ahead and move these in. These are in on the 26th. Battle's going to continue. Alright, so you can see that according to the numbers, these units have entered the battle, right? As they're on the province, but are they actually in the battle? And the answer to that is no. A unit is not taking part in battle unless it has 1 or more units on the field. And because none of these units have cycled out, because we've got all these extra units in front of it that are still there, this unit is not technically in the battle. So why is this important? It doesn't matter if we do it this day. We could actually run the clock a few more days. But the important thing is the unit in battle? Let's go ahead and run the clock 1 more day just to demonstrate. Alright, so this unit has now technically been in battle for 2 days. What happens if we leave that 1 unit in battle and pull out everything else? Watch this. There is now nothing left on the defending side. The battle is still taking place. According to the metrics, we still have all these units in battle, but we have nothing on the field. So watch what happens if we run it for 1 more day. Now we've lost the battle. So even though we still had all these units there on that province, because they weren't on the field, it acted as if they weren't in the battle, and we lost by default. So, when is this an issue? Well, if you've got one of these huge battles that's been taking place for months or years, where you've got several players in a multiplayer game on each side trying to micromanage their particular armies, if one person shifts in a large number of troops, and then the people that are in the battle shift out a large number of troops, you run the risk of accidentally pulling out every single unit that's engaged in the battle and losing the battle. This has happened in multiplayer games, and oftentimes the people that it happens to just kind of end up scratching their heads, not realizing what happened. And this is why it happens. So be aware of it. If you're taking part in huge battles, you want to make sure that at least some of your troops remain engaged in the battle before you move all the rest out. Now, how can you make sure this never happens to you? Well, the way you can make sure this never happens to you is to not cycle all of your troops simultaneously. So, once again, I'll restart the battle here. We'll go from the other side. Again, it's going to be 12 days before we can pull any of these troops out, so that's counting down. We got 7 now. Again, you click, drag, select around all of your troops, and you can deselect the ones that you want to leave in the battle and just pull out the ones that you need to cycle. And the safer bet is to pull out fewer troops simultaneously. So 1 or 2 at a time is obviously the safest, but as long as you have some troops that are more or less intact remaining in the battle, it's safe to pull out several at once. Again, the exact number that you can pull out at once kind of varies, but by looking at the individual units, you get a pretty good idea of which ones are actually still in the battle. If they have no organization left whatsoever, clearly they're not in battle. If they have no strength, then they're clearly not in battle, but if they're, around halfway or so, then they very likely are engaged. Ones that are not engaged still have most of their org and most of their strength. Ones that are engaging are slowly losing their organ strength, so the ones that are at low organ strength are the ones that you want to pull out. Hopefully that was clear to everyone, because I'm not re-recording this section again. Alright, let's go ahead and retreat from this battle. Now, as another aside, this tends to be more of an issue later on in the game, because as you proceed through the game, combat width decreases, and as combat width decreases, that lowers the maximum number of brigades that you can have on the field on your side, which means you're more likely to accidentally pull out all the units on your side. So after about 1880, just try and make a conscious effort not to accidentally lose battles in this way. One final thing to demonstrate here before we move on. So you notice at the start of this battle we've got 0.87 war exhaustion, and again, it's going to be 11 days before either side can retreat, but let's go ahead and run the clock. On the other side, I'm going to be pulling in some German troops. Alright, so we got 0.87. You'll notice this is not going up right now. As the month ticks over, this might be impacted slightly. So 0.87, still 0.87, okay. So we're taking losses in this battle. You can see that the strengths are dropping, the organization is dropping, and at this point we can retreat. Well, let's pull out a few of these units, just as we would normally cycle. We'll pull out half of these units, just like you might if you were actually cycling. At 0.87, you'll notice this is still 0.87. And that is, as you pull troops out of battle and you cycle them, it doesn't impact your war exhaustion. But if we go ahead and pull all the units out, so we went ahead and pulled the rest of the troops out, and as France we get plus 0.33. And if we look, that's now been applied. So what does this mean? Well, it means the last person out of battle is the one that gets basically all of the war exhaustion and the prestige loss if you're the one retreating. Now, if you're attacking, or if there are multiple people on the side, it presumably gets split between them, but especially in a multiplayer game, as you're cycling, it might come to the situation where you are the only person left in battle, and it can be the case where you'll get the entire penalty for that entire battle, and if that battle's been raging for years, you might get a ton of war exhaustion out of it. So it's not a good system, but that's just the way it is. Be aware of it. But you can also use this to your advantage, or to be a dick if you choose. And that is, if you are in a battle, and if you don't want to take any war exhaustion or prestige loss, then you can just run out of that battle and let your allies take it for you. And that's especially true if it's AIs that you're playing with. So why would you take the losses if you can just let the AI take it for you? Now, we've already seen how quickly an army can replenish. So simply doing a lot of damage in a battle, or even winning a battle, is not sufficient to destroy the enemy's fighting capabilities. So how do we keep the enemy from re-engaging us? Well, we have to destroy their army. So now we're going to talk about how to stack wipe. So if your organization is completely depleted before the first stage of battle is over and before you can retreat, then you run the risk of being stack wiped. Let's go ahead and pull these units out. So we're going to retreat. Now, as these units are retreating, they're going to be regaining organization each day, so there is going to be a slight amount of organization as these units continue into France. So I'm going to chase these units with the German stacks, and what we'll see is that as we continue, these units are going to be recovering a tiny bit of organization by the time these units get here, and it looks like the German stacks actually beat us here. But the key thing we're looking at is the number here, the number of troops. We've got about 8k left. We see there are 11 additional days before this battle is over. And we'll just go ahead and play this out real quick. Alright, so we've actually got just a tiny bit of organization left. I was hoping we'd get a stack wipe here. We got approximately 75 times as many troops on the German side versus the French side, but that doesn't matter as long as these units have not been completely depleted of org. We can pull them out of battle, and they will live to fight another day. Let's go ahead and continue. We're going to pursue. I'm just going to send one single stack after them. We've got 1k units. We've got very, very low org. Let's see what happens. Alright, so we've been engaged, and it looks like we're probably just going to get wiped as a result of losing all of our men here, but let's go ahead and play it out. Alright, so thus we've been stack wiped. Let's see if we can't do this in the other direction, just for the sake of example. So clearly having artillery in the front row is a bad thing, right? So let's just have a bunch of backline units in the front row and see what happens. Alright, so we're going to have 15k troops here. These are all back row units. We're going to have nothing in the front row, and I'm going to move some German stacks on top of them, and we'll see what happens. So these units are now moving onto the undefended back row. This is yet another reason why you don't want to have your artillery stacks out in the open where the enemy can get to them easily. Alright, so we're taking heavy losses. Organization plummeting. Hopefully we'll get a decent counter roll here. Alright, so we've only got 1k troops here. Got a 9 rolled, which is, again, not quite what I was hoping for. But basically we've lost all of our men, and our org has plummeted, and we got stack wiped. And you can see that the numbers don't quite make sense here. And sometimes this can happen when you get stack wiped. The game gets confused about exactly which troops got killed. So sometimes that works to your benefit, sometimes it doesn't. Let's go ahead and continue this. We'll get another back row. Alright, so we're losing organization, we're losing men. We're losing organization slightly faster than we're losing men, and really that's what I was hoping for here. Let's see if we can't get a stack wipe without actually losing all the men. We had that earlier on in the demonstrations, but just kind of hoping to show it again. It's not quite working out, but maybe you can just use your imagination. Alright, so now we're taking substantially lower loss than before, but our organization is almost capped out. Alright, so we lost our organization. I believe as a result of that last roll, we technically still had some strength left in that unit, but it didn't matter because we lost all our organization. Once you lose all your organization, your unit gets wiped. And maybe the best way to demonstrate this of any would be to set our military spending to 0. So if your military spending is 0, then your organization is 0, and it takes a day to update that. So our organization, well, it's not quite 0, but close enough. Alright, let's go ahead and move these on, see what happens. 21st. Alright, so we're taking huge losses, but you can see our organization is almost 0 already. Alright, so our organization is basically 0. We still have men fighting in the battle. We still have 7 days left, so let's see if these units can last 7 days. You'll notice at this point that because our organization is so low, we're actually not taking losses, which is sort of an odd feature, I guess. Might consider it a bug of Victoria 2. That is, we're in the battle. The enemy clearly has effective units. Our units are, for the most part, no longer on the field. So we've got all these men just running for their lives. But we've got 2 units in battle, and they're hardly taking any losses at all. In fact, they're not taking any losses at all according to the numbers. But we've still got 3 days left, so let's go ahead and run it. 1, 2. Alright, so there we got stack wiped. We had the vast majority of our men still there, still technically on that province, but it didn't matter. We lost our organization. If your organization falls to 0, your men get destroyed. Alright, so that's the first way you can stack wipe units, is to completely deplete their organization. I'm glad that worked out. I wasn't sure if it was going to be a decent demonstration or not. Alright. The next and more common way to stack wipe an army is to prevent it from being able to retreat. At this point, we've got 3 German stacks on 2 French provinces, and they are completely surrounded by French troops. If at this point the German units were to move in any direction to try and break out, they would have to fight the French units, right? So let's say, for the sake of example, I want to destroy this 60k stack, right? I'm going to take these 120k French troops, and they're not full organization, but I don't feel like waiting any longer. We're going to move these troops onto this stack. Alright, so battle has started. And in 11 days, these units have the potential to retreat. Now the question is, where can the enemy effectively retreat? And this is not exactly a straightforward answer, because it depends a lot on what rules you're playing by. But let's look at the French as an example, because they're already in the battle. And if we wanted to, we could cycle. Let's see also how all these different things come together. So let's say, as an example, we have this unit and we want to retreat him from this battle. We could retreat him to the next province. We could retreat him onto a province that already has a unit on it. We could, even if we wanted to, retreat a unit all the way across France. This unit will be unengageable until it gets to its destination, just like a shattered retreat in EU4. So we have a number of options, right? And that is, if we're in battle, we can retreat to practically any province that we can walk to. But one of the most common rules in multiplayer games is that you're not allowed to retreat more than 1 province. And there are several reasons for this. The first is that it completely defeats the purpose of trench warfare, which is a lot of what Victoria 2 is emulating. But it also just makes the game ridiculous, because you'll have armies retreating all the way across Europe. Imagine EU4 before the fort system was enacted. So you had armies just retreating back and forth across the entire country. You could have that exact same situation in Victoria 2. And if you have that situation, it's a nightmare. People have done it. People try and troll and do it, but it just doesn't work. It kind of breaks the game. And especially because you as a player can do it, but the AI can't. So even in single player, I'm going to recommend that you impose this rule upon yourself, which is don't retreat more than 1 province. And you'll also notice that I can't do anything with this unit because he's shattered retreating to that destination, so he's just completely out of combat. And if this were a multiplayer game, this unit would be deleted, so let's go ahead and get him out of here. But in this battle, we've got a few different options. So you'll notice that if I click this unit, and if I click on this province with a German unit on it, I cannot retreat to that province, right? So I'm a French unit. I can only retreat to those provinces that either have friendly units on them or no units at all. But from the German side, the Germans can only retreat to 3 provinces. One being this province here with no one on it, this one with no one on it, or this one with the German unit. Or of course they could cheat and go all the way back to Germany. But we're not going to be cheating because, again, that defeats the purpose of the game. So me, as the French player, I know where this unit can retreat. One of these 3 provinces, right? The only reason it can retreat to these 2 provinces is because there's no one on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to move a unit onto these 2 provinces. It's going to take a few days. And just like that, it doesn't matter how many units are on the province, whether it's a full stack or even just a single 3k stack, but I've now blocked the Germans from retreating to these 2 provinces, which means the only legal move that this army can make is to move back to this province. Now, there are actually 2 German units on this province taking part in the battle. What I'm going to do is, to demonstrate, I'm going to move one of these units out, the highly depleted one. Alright, so that unit is now retreating to join its comrade here, but we've still got 1 German unit taking part in this battle, right? Now, the only reason that this unit was able to retreat to this province is because there's a friendly unit on it. Now, what happens if there's a battle taking place on that province? Well, I'm going to move this particular 30 stack onto that province to start a battle. So you know, we've got 2 battles taking place here, and to demonstrate from the French side, because of the battle taking place here, I can no longer retreat to that province. So I'm right clicking and nothing is happening. If I were to click on any of these other provinces, I would retreat out of the battle, but because there's a battle taking place here, I can't move on to it. So if a unit is completely surrounded, that is, every single province around it either is not accessible because there's a unit on it, there's a unit already on it, there's a battle taking place, or maybe it just doesn't have military access, that unit can't go anywhere. So we can let this battle play out. You'll notice that the enemy is hardly taking any losses at all. They're only losing about, 150 units per day, which is nothing. We're taking very heavy losses here. This is basically a last stand situation. Once this organization drops to 0, again, I'm going to be cycling some troops out here. So we're going to be cycling out 14k. And we have to be very careful to make sure that we don't leave an opening. So if these units are marching out and simultaneously these units are marching in, there is the possibility of this province being open, in which case this unit can retreat. But we want to make sure there's units standing here so that doesn't happen. So we're just going to keep these battles going. And again, it doesn't matter how many troops you have surrounding, as long as there is someone surrounding it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to, let's ditch an engineer. We'll move the rest of these troops onto the battle to keep that one going. Because the key here is we want to kill this unit and make sure he can't retreat anywhere. So we're going to keep this battle going even though we're taking heavy losses because we want to kill this unit. So remember, replenishing your losses is fairly fast. Rebuilding stacks takes a long time and might not be possible at all. You'll notice also that in last stand situations, the defenders will tend to last a lot longer than they might otherwise. So in this case, we killed all the men that were in that battle. In this case, let's go ahead and pull some people out. Again, it looks like we're going to kill all the units before the organization drops to 0. And it doesn't really matter which of these hits 0 first. If you have nowhere that you can possibly retreat, then your unit gets wiped. So the key here is that if you want to kill an army, you have to make sure that it can't retreat, whether that's to a province with no one on it, or whether that's to another province that has an enemy standing on it. And again, if you're a player, you can cheat or use an exploit, which is that you can retreat to any province that you like. But again, I would encourage you not to do that because it really detracts from the game. So now that you know the two most common ways to stack wipe units, let's talk about how you can use this information to most effectively organize your units. There are 4 primary ways to organize your troops, and I'm going to be explaining the pros and cons of each of these, but I'm not going to be showing too many examples just in the interest of saving time. Now, the simplest one is just a single stack, and that can be a made stack, it can be just a stack of irregulars, this can be really anything you want. But the key features of an isolated stack are, well, that it's isolated. It's not part of your larger army, and it's not taking part in more sophisticated maneuvers. So single isolated stacks tend to work well in controlling rebels. If you have relatively low population areas that you want to invade, this can work well. But the primary drawback is that if this unit gets into trouble, it's pretty much dead. So if this single unit were to come up against, say, 3 enemy units, it's dead regardless of where it is, right? It's going to get surrounded, it's going to get taken out. But, for example, if you're playing Russia, you've got this huge area to cover. If you have every single one of your troops over here on the western border, if you have some rebellion off in eastern Russia, you need someone to deal with it, so that's a good situation where you want to have that isolated 30 stack to go deal with it. If you're playing France and you've got a rebellion in the mainland, you can pull your troops back to deal with it. So in the case of France, where you want to have isolated troops, well, Algeria is a really good place. So if you have a rebellion down here, you might have 1 or 2 isolated stacks down here to deal with them. If I'm playing a naval power, oftentimes I will have 10 clipper transports along with a 30k stack that's isolated, just so that if there's a rebellion, I can very quickly move that unit onto a clipper transport and then get him wherever he's needed so he can wipe out rebellions. But it's really dangerous to perform an invasion with an isolated stack because, again, the key feature of an isolated stack is that it's isolated, so if it gets into trouble, no one's going to be there to help it. A step up from a single stack is a grouping of units, and that's demonstrated here even though these aren't perfect 30 stacks. The primary benefit of a grouping of stacks is high mobility. So if you have a number of stacks, say in the center of your country, you can move these around as needed very quickly. And obviously, if one gets into trouble, you've got other units there able to reinforce it. if that unit needs to retreat, because these provinces have units on them, you can safely retreat and no one's going to be able to block you. The biggest downside is that depending on the size of the grouping, it's very easy to get isolated and completely destroyed. So as an example, if none of these units were here, and this was my entire army, well, the NGF could just walk in and completely surround this grouping, and because it's surrounded, if we're using the rule that you can't retreat through a line, that means that these units can only retreat onto each other, and one by one there's going to be battles taking place, and as these battles take place, those units get cut off, and one by one these get wiped out until there's only a single province left with anything on it, and then one big battle and the whole group of units is gone. When is a grouping of units useful? Well, if you don't have to maintain a line, it can be very useful to have units in a centralized location where you can move them out as needed. The example I gave earlier was Japan. So I had a grouping of units in Japan, which was my sorting center, and from Japan I could then move them out as needed. So I had a line in Korea and Manchuria, but within Japan I had a grouping of stacks. And again, if anyone were to invade Japan, it takes time to do a naval invasion, so I could very effectively move that grouping as needed within Japan. Another great example where a grouping of units can be useful is Spain. Spain and France very rarely go to war with each other, so it's not necessary to maintain a line on the French border. Portugal is more often than not a pushover, and in multiplayer often an AI, so dealing with Portugal doesn't require a full line and all the strategic considerations you need when going against a player. So in the case of Spain, having a group of units in the center of the country which can then be moved out as needed in either direction, and especially if Spain and France are allied, these units can very quickly move up and reinforce the French line. This is a good situation where you can have a grouping of units and be very effective. And of course you can turn your groups into lines as needed. USA is another example where a group of units might be better than a line. And the reason why is because having an effective line as the USA is quite difficult because there's just so much land to cover. You want to have an entire line against Canada? Well, your southern border is going to be open. You want to have a line against Mexico? I mean, you can, but the distances between provinces are so huge that even if you have a line, it's going to be difficult to reinforce the other members of the line. And if you do have a line against Mexico, well, your northern border is open. So having units in a more centralized region, or even multiple groups in centralized regions, means you'll be able to move those groups around as needed to deal with conflicts as they arise. But a place where groupings of units might be more effective is, for example, central Russia, because if you're trying to reinforce across these substantially larger provinces, that can take way longer. It can take way longer to reinforce a line, and it diminishes the effectiveness of the line. So we'll talk about lines in just a moment. But the key here is that if you have groupings of units, and if those units are able to effectively support each other, then you don't have to deal with situations where an isolated unit, say at the end of a line, is getting picked off because you can't get to it fast enough. Now, the third and perhaps least common organization is what's commonly referred to as the doom stack. Oftentimes, doom stacks will be so large that by simply walking around they'll be taking attrition, but we have to consider what the doom stack is for. So we saw in one of the earlier examples when France was invaded from NGF, we had, I think, 90k troops coming into a 30 stack, and that 90k troops completely destroyed the 30 stack even though there were units still left in that stack. Well, the goal of the doom stack is not to take territory, the goal of the doom stack is not to hold a line. The goal of the doom stack is to do a lot of damage as quickly as possible by bringing overwhelming firepower into the battle. Right now the NGF is an AI. I'm just going to let them walk in for a bit because I'm going to demonstrate exactly how a doom stack is useful. So I've got this large unit here and it's taking attrition, but as you'll notice the NGF is splitting its troops. Doom stacks are incredibly effective against AI because AI have no concept of how to hold a line. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let the enemy walk into the country and disperse themselves a bit. Well, look at that. We've got 144k here. We've got just a 14k just sitting here, right? What happens if we move that unit onto there? We've got a 4 attack. We've got a fantastic general. As I mentioned many times, you want to make sure you know where your good generals are. We want to have a really good general leading this doom stack. We're just going to move him onto that 14k. There's 38 more coming in, but I don't think it's going to make a difference. Let's see what happens. Of course, we get pop-ups, but look at that damage. I mean, we've got -2 penalty, but it doesn't even matter because look at all the damage we're doing. I'm just going to ignore that unit. So yeah, this is how doom stacks work. We don't care that we're being occupied. We don't care that we got all these units walking around. The only thing we care about is this an opportune time to pick off individual stacks? Here we've got another 4 attack. We got a 30k here. That 30k is isolated. There's no one anywhere close to it. Let's go ahead and move on to it. This unit's getting completely destroyed. This unit is taking heavy damage. We're also taking damage, but it doesn't matter quite as much because as a percentage, our losses are nowhere near as high as the enemy losses. So that was a win. Because we don't care about occupations, our goal is to win battles. So ideally stack wipe, but even if we can't stack wipe, we still want to do as much damage as possible. So let's go ahead and reinforce this unit. It's going to get there in time. We've got, again, 130k coming in to reinforce, and this guy is going to be dead very soon. Over here in the northwest, this unit is just about dead. Now, obviously, you can have doom stacks of different sizes, and the size of the doom stack is going to have a huge impact on how effective it is. But, again, I think this shows quite nicely what the goal is. We're doing here 4 times as much damage to the enemy, and that's just because we're bringing overwhelming firepower to bear against them. Now, if you're micromanaging, if this were single player, you could, as an example, separate out the individual units from your doom stack that are depleted, and you can let them recover. So you can just set them to, like, you know, a hospital province or something. Just have some safe area where you can retreat them to, and that's certainly a possibility. And in the meantime, your stack just keeps going. Now, if this stack were to sit here, obviously the enemy would come in around it, but you know, we can even keep this depleted stack with the main army as it moves along, and just keep track of which one's which. But yeah, that's how doom stacks work. So pick off the weak, kill them off. As you kill them off, they're no longer there to reinforce the stronger units, and so on. And we can let this play out. Now, obviously, France in this case is being occupied, but we just don't care about the occupations, because once this entire army is dead, we can just at our leisure unoccupy everything and then go in and win the war. So this is yet another reason why the AI is kind of a pushover in Victoria 2, because it doesn't know what to do against doom stacks, and also doesn't know what to do against lines. Okay, so that's how you use a doom stack, but when should you use a doom stack? And there are a lot of things to consider here, and again, it's not one size fits all, but some general rules. If you're playing against the AI has no idea how to deal with the doom stack, so you can almost always make a doom stack work. If you're using doom stacks, you want to pick favorable battles, which means that you want to take terrain into consideration. I haven't talked too much about terrain, but basically, let's say you're playing Austria-Hungary. You know, you would think Austria-Hungary, they're going to have a hell of a time against Russia, right? Because Russia's got like 3 times as many troops. But you just let those troops walk through. You don't even care if they're in the Carpathians. You wait till they get into Hungary. You got all these plains, few river crossings. You can just march through and destroy them. So, you know, be mindful of the terrain, because terrain can only hurt you if you're attacking, and if you're using doom stacks, you're always going to be attacking. Now, as we proceed through the game, battles will tend to favor defense more and more because of combat with reductions and dig in and forts and that sort of thing. So as a result of that, doom stacks tend to be more effective earlier in the game than in the late game. In the early game, we can have a combat width of 30. You can fill out the entire thing with a doom stack and just completely roll over anyone. On the late game, if you're in the mountains and your combat width is 5 or 10, you know, it doesn't even matter that you've got this giant stack there, because most of them aren't going to be in the battle and doing damage. The further you get through the game, the less effective doom stacks are going to be, you know, with some exceptions. Another situation where doom stacks are really effective is if you have gas attack and your enemy doesn't have gas defense. So again, the goal is to do as much damage as possible. If you've got that extra leg up, and if you can bring the full strength of your army to bear against individual stacks with that added gas attack, you're going to completely destroy them. That's a relatively late game situation where doom stacks can work well, if you have gas attack and the enemy doesn't have gas defense. Another great example of a situation where doom stacks can work is in the case of Mexico. So in the early game, Mexico and the US often get into one or more wars. Now, at almost any stage of the game, Mexico is going to have fewer men than the United States. So you can imagine that if these two sides were just lining up their units across from each other, the US is probably going to win. But in this region, we've got fairly large provinces that take a long time to walk through. If you are grouping all of your units as the US, you're going to take heavy attrition. So you can force the US to do things that it doesn't want to do by creating a doom stack of your own. So as Mexico, especially in the early game when you've got Santa Anna as a god general, you can just pile all your units together, and yes, you're going to take a lot of losses to attrition, but as I mentioned several times, make sure your national focuses are on soldiers if you're in a war. You're going to pile all your troops together and send them into battle one after another and just completely destroy the USA. Of course, don't underestimate the effect of dice rolls, which, can turn against you, but, with a few lucky dice rolls, you can just completely destroy the USA's army. And if you happen to win one battle, those units will retreat. Because they're only allowed to retreat one province, you can just chase them down. So if you win one battle, you're almost guaranteed to win the next one, and so on. You can just chase units until they're all completely destroyed, and then you win the war. Places where doom stacks don't work very well are places where the attrition is incredibly high. So Brazil, probably not a nation where you want to use a doom stack, because not only are these provinces huge and they take months to get across, but the whole time you're in that province, the supply limit is low, your attrition is going to be just off the charts, and because your population is relatively low, your army is just going to wither away and die before you can even have a chance to have an impact. So Brazil, probably not a nation where you want to use doom stacks. Other situations where doom stacks can work. Often in the early game, Sikh, Afghanistan, and Persia will go to war with each other, and if that's the case, these are nations with fairly small militaries compared to their size, and because they're low tech, the supply limits are also going to be low. So if you can force a battle, and if the conditions are favorable, a doom stack can work. But if you can't force the battle, then you're just going to be taking very high attrition. So this might be a situation where a group of stacks would be better than a doom stack. But again, if you force the battle, these provinces are fairly large, so if you force the battle might be over by the time the reinforcements arrive. And this is especially true in the case of AI, which can micromanage their troops on a day-to-day basis. So just be aware of that. I think this NGF invasion of France is a really good example of how even in the mid-game doom stacks can work very well. But now let's get to the fourth and final organization which everyone's been waiting for, which is the line. Now, not all lines are created equal, and we'll talk about what makes a good line versus a bad line. But the general idea is that on one side of the line you've got relative safety, you can move troops around, you can recruit, you can organize, you can get reinforcements up and back, you can retreat, and the enemy can't get to you, so whatever happens back there, you can do in relative safety. On the other side, you've got the enemy or the unknown, whatever that happens to be. So this is the main difference between a group of units and a line. A line defends an area. A group of units defends the group of units. Now, you can turn a group of units into a makeshift line, and you can, of course, collapse a line into a group of units, but the purpose of each is very different. And if you are creating one line to oppose another line, the purpose of that line doesn't change. The enemy has presented its line, you are creating your line to keep everything behind it safe. So if NGF were to line up all of its troops right here along this border, the purpose of those troops on this border would be exactly the same as our troops along this side of the border. That is, NGF is trying to keep everything on this side safe. If, as an example, these troops weren't here, and if the NGF could walk through the Netherlands, then these troops could just walk around and surround us. So this would be a case where we'd have a group of units rather than a true line. Where the line needs to be will in part depend on strategic considerations we'll talk about in the next video. So in this video we're going to talk about how to use a line. So what makes a good line, what makes a bad line? Well, let's look at Russia for an example of what makes a really terrible line. Alright, so what I've drawn here is a hypothetical Russian line. And this is the sort of line that a lot of new players like to make. And the rationale behind it is, well, I'm going to put all my troops right on the border, and I'm going to make sure that no one can get past them. And, part of that rationale makes sense. That is, you want to keep the area, you want to keep as much of your area safe from enemies as possible. But why is this actually a really terrible line? There's a few different reasons. So first, recall that the one foolproof way to stack wipe a unit is to surround it. And you can surround it either with your own units or by initiating battles around it. So that means that if Germany can attack here and here, then this unit is completely isolated. It can't retreat through this province or through this province, assuming you're not cheating. You can't retreat through either of these two provinces, and on this side you've got the German army, so this unit just gets completely destroyed. Let's go ahead and delete it. So this province is one of the worst ones you can possibly put a unit on as Russia. The same thing happens right here. Now these provinces are a little bit more difficult to see, but the province of Rovna is completely surrounded by 4 provinces on the Austrian side, which means that if Austria initiates battles here and here, this province is completely cut off and it can be destroyed. Of course, losses are going to be heavier because it's in the forest, but that's one additional unit that can be wiped out. So this province is also a really terrible one to have a unit on. We'd also consider that one of the main reasons we're using a line is so we can have this safe area in the back where we can cycle units, move them around, let our depleted ones get some of their strength back, and then get the fresh ones to the front, right? Well, what's the big problem in this region of the line? Well, first, one more problem here is if we're at war with both NGF and Austria, that means these units can just be picked off one at a time. So we already saw how Calais can get wiped out, but if we initiate a battle here and here, that means that this province is now isolated too, so it can get wiped out. So that province is gone. Well, what happens now? You've got this one under attack and this one under attack, so this one's wiped out too. So you have all these units on the front that are just going to get picked off one after the other, right? And the reason why, if you want to think of it this way, is that any frontline province on a line that doesn't have direct access behind the line is going to be in extreme danger. So the only way to reinforce these three provinces is to go through the line, right? Which means that if you attack the line, you can't walk through it, you can't reinforce it, these units get destroyed. So we can see why reinforcing the entire border is not necessarily the best thing to do. But even if we take this line, it's still not the best one we can come up with. And why is that? Well, first off, our defensive positions are non-existent. We've got three provinces right here. We've got plains. We're getting no defensive bonuses. If the enemy were to come through provinces without river crossings, they would get no penalties from the river crossings, and I'll talk about rivers in a moment. But basically, we're just inviting the enemy to walk across and just completely destroy this whole section of the army. So we want to have strong defensive positions in addition to areas that can be easily reinforced as needed. So again, looking why this line is a terrible line. If we want to reinforce Radom, we have to go through this province. If we want to reinforce either of these two provinces, we have to go through Warsaw. So we have this choke point where everything that's reinforcing this whole section of the front has to come through this one province. That's really terrible if you're trying to move troops in both directions. So let's say you got a unit here and you need to get him way over here. Well, it's going to take a long time, right? So that means you need to pile your troops in Warsaw. But if you pile too many troops in Warsaw, you're going to be taking attrition. So it just doesn't work out very well. And at the same time, you're going to be cycling troops out. So if you're in one of these huge battles and you're cycling troops, you got troops coming in, you got troops coming out. But not only are they marching in and out, they have to march through this long corridor to get in or out. So this province is a huge liability. So realistically, this is a terrible place to have a unit. Let's pull that one out. Well, now I've got this province here, right? It's plains, so you don't get any defensive bonuses. You've got a river going around it on the wrong side, so if Germany is here or here, it can attack down and just completely destroy it. So this is a terrible province to have a unit too. Let's get him out of there. Same issue here. There's a river running behind it, so the river is actually on the wrong side. This is a terrible province to have as part of your line. So what happens? Well, what happens if we move our line back? Let's put it here instead. So remember when we started this, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 provinces, including this one, that all had units on them, right? But now we've replaced all that with one unit. So all those extra units are now here in the back line, and they can be moved around as needed. So, just put them wherever you like. And these units, if they need to, they can move in, support that province or this one or so on. And, you can counterattack with them. You've got more options because you have consolidated your army. So they're no longer spread out quite as thin. Those consolidated units are in better defensive positions. So even though this is plains, you got to cross a river to get to it. So you're going to get at least some bonus. Obviously in the forest, you've got that defensive bonus. So, you've got the enemy marching in, and then they've occupied a few provinces. Contrary to popular belief, wars are very rarely won by occupations alone. So just let the enemy march in, let them occupy a few provinces, because in the process, you are saving your military where you can more effectively use it elsewhere. All right, so we saw how we took a terrible line, we pulled all of these units back, and we now have a very good defensive line. But, we could, if we wanted to, even make this more effective. We've got this whole region, which is nothing but plains, right? And remember, plains don't give you a defensive bonus aside from the fort that might be on it. So, being on the plains is kind of a liability. You've got a river here, but in this province it's on the wrong side, so you can attack. So Germany could attack into this province, but there's a river behind it. So that doesn't help you. There's no river at all here, so Germany can attack this province, and it's just not going to help you. You've got a forest here, you've got forest down here, but you've got this huge line of forest, right? So let's say you move your line back to this point. You've got an incredibly strong defensive position. If the enemy attacks you anywhere along this line, you get the benefit of being in the forest, you get the combat width reduction. In some cases, you also get river crossings, but basically, it's going to be a much tougher nut to crack than if you're right here exposed along the border. Now, there are some things to consider here because this is a large chunk of your country that's being occupied, but it really depends on what the situation is, and we'll talk about that more in the strategic video. But what else does this allow? Well, you've got this fantastic defensive position, but if the enemy forms its line right up next to you, guess where they are? They're exposed on the plains. So if you are in the forest and they're exposed on the plains, well, guess what? You can just counterattack right into them. And then they're going to take the heavy losses that you'd be taking otherwise. So, again, it's one thing to take into consideration when you're looking at where to place your line. I'm not saying you should always pull back to the forest, but depending on the circumstances, especially if you're in a weak position, you know, if you're playing mega Soviet Russia and you've got the largest military in the world, it's probably not necessary to do this. But if you're weak and you've lost a few wars, and you know things are not going well, then it might be worthwhile to actually retreat from the front. You say, oh, I'm going to lose all that land. Well, is it actually good land? You know, again, this is something you have to consider when you look at the strategic considerations. But from a strictly tactical situation, it's probably going to be best if you get back to that stronger defensive position. I'll just reiterate, the most important feature of a line is the defensive capability. The ability to move units around behind it, to reinforce, to cycle as needed. And so having salience, this sort of bulge, is really, really terrible for a defensive position. On the flip side, if you are attacking, salience can be great. That is, if you have a strong position and you are projecting outward, salience allow you to attack a larger region of the enemy than you have to attack from. But the flip side is also true that the enemy can attack you from multiple sides, whereas you're going to have a hard time reinforcing if you're on the defensive. So, let's move over to the French border. Again, depending on who's allied and who's not, you'll need to tweak your line accordingly. As an example, if the Netherlands is allied with the NGF, and if they are going to be joining against you, then you need to create a line taking into consideration that the enemy is going to be coming through Belgium. If, on the other hand, the Netherlands is your ally and is likely to join you against Germany, that means you need to position your line accordingly. This might mean you'll be moving your troops into Allied territory to help bolster their line. And this often happens in multiplayer games where, in hotly contested areas, you might have 3 or 4 nations just parking their troops in Allied territory in case war breaks out. But let's look at this potential line in the Netherlands from each side. So on the French side, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 provinces directly in contact with either Netherlands or NGF or soon to be Germany, right? Is there a better way to position this line? Well, the answer is no. If we pull back from any of these provinces to try and consolidate, we haven't really gained anything in the process, right? So in the case of Russia, we pulled 6 units off the front and moved them to the back line, right? In the case of France, if we were to say move this unit back 1 province and this unit back 1 province, we haven't really gained anything. So unless we're willing to give up large sections of the front, it's not really possible to consolidate this line. Also notice that because we've got all these additional provinces and every single province on the front has access to the back line, this line is pretty well optimized for France in this area. But let's look at some hypothetical situations here. So if France and Netherlands are allied, the entire Dutch front with the NGF is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 provinces, right? Because if we want to cover the entire front, we have to cover every single one of these provinces. So can you do this? Technically, yes. Is it a good line? Well, it's debatable. And here's the reason why. Does it defend everything behind it? Yes, it does. Can you get to every single frontline province from the back line? Yes, you can. And that means even if you have to walk across this strait right here, you can get to all of these provinces up here. But what's the downside? The downside is that you've got a lot of provinces to cover, and you could pull back 3 of these provinces and move them to the back line. So in this case, we've got 8 units that have to be on the front at all times. What happens if we move these 3 units to the back? Well, these units can now reinforce the front, be cycled out as needed. We can still get to every single unit here from this section of the Netherlands. And yes, we would, in theory, lose this portion of the Netherlands. As long as we have a boat here, the Germans can't just walk across and take the capital. But yes, we could let the Germans occupy these 4 provinces, move these units back, and make them more effective elsewhere. But that's the sort of consideration that you need to make as a player depending on the circumstances and you know, whether you need those extra units more than you need to defend those 3 provinces. I hope you can see from this as a general rule that lines with fewer provinces tend to work better than lines with more provinces, because the fewer provinces you need to cover, the more effectively you can manage your troops in the back line and get them to wherever they're needed in the front. Is this a perfect situation for the Netherlands? Obviously not. But again, it's a question of, do you want to win the war, or do you want to defend these 4 provinces for a few seconds longer? Let's look at this from the flip side. If this was the actual line, where is NGF most likely to attack? Well, here we've got forests, which means that if NGF attacks in any of these provinces, they get a -1 dice roll. Same with Luxembourg. Here we've got a fairly open area, but it's easy to get cut off here. Line considerations work both ways, but attacking into Spa is actually a terrible idea for the NGF, and I'll show you exactly why. If NGF attacks into Spa, anyone that's here can be cut off by simply attacking into Aachen and Trier. So if you attack into a province, and if the defense can counterattack and cut you off, then that's not a good place to attack. And we'll be talking about how to break through a line later, but this is a terrible province to attack into for that reason, because anyone that gets stuck here can be completely cut off and destroyed. Now this goes both ways in sort of 4D chess and who counterattacks where, but in general you want to attack into provinces that you can't be cut off from. An attack into Metz could realistically be cut off by counterattacking into Saarbrücken. So that means you're looking as an attacker for provinces that can't be cut off if there's a counterattack. We've already established that to this point the defense is in a fantastic position. Is attacking into this province a good idea? No, because this one can be cut off, this one can be cut off. Is attacking into this province a good idea? This is probably the worst one of all, because you're attacking into forests and across the river. You get a -2 offensive penalty, and you can get cut off in the back. So that one's terrible. How about this one? Well, you can attack from either of these 2 provinces, but in theory this one can get cut off, and so can this one. So this one's not a good one to attack to. So what does that leave? Well, it's this whole area up here. So if you're NGF, and if France and the Netherlands are maintaining this entire line, the logical place to attack is this exposed region right up here, because number 1, there's only a single way in, and that way in can't be cut off. Number 2, by attacking multiple places yourself, you can cut off the enemy and chase them where they won't be able to retreat. So if you're able to engage in multiple points, you're going to very quickly overwhelm these troops. You can cut them off by attacking in the back if you so choose, and the only way these troops are going to get out is right through here, and any that don't get out get stack wiped in this province right here. And really you end up in the same exact situation. The only difference is that if you have these troops here, they're going to get killed or heavily depleted, versus the case where you pull them back yourself and you can utilize them at their full capacity. So this is again the sort of consideration that you need to make when you're looking at whether you're going to utilize the line or not. Also, something to note, when it comes to river crossings, it's not always obvious. The general rule is that if your movement arrow crosses a river, you're going to take a penalty for crossing a river. But in some cases it's easier to tell than others. So like in this case, is that a river crossing? Technically you're crossing a river, so probably. But in this case, where the river follows the border, it's definitely going to be a river crossing. In some cases you might want to test it out if this is critical for your defenses. But the easiest thing to do is just consider that where there's a river along a border, that's going to be a river crossing. If there is a river in the middle of a province, I would assume that there's going to be a crossing regardless of which way you go, although it's going to vary on a case-by-case basis. So I would assume that from Nancy you're going to get crossings in every direction. Some of them are obvious, some of them are not, and that's just the way Victoria 2 is. Okay, so we've looked at good lines, we've looked at bad lines, we've looked at how to use a line, why to use a line, but now we're going to put all the pieces together and look at how to break a line. I think as a good counterexample, let's consider what we're not talking about when we're looking at breaking a line. You've probably played against an AI at this point, and you'll know that if you have a hole in your line, the AI will send their entire army through that one hole and start occupying your country, right? Is this useful? No, it's actually not. And we saw why it's not useful, because if you have doom stacks, you can pick off those units one by one. So simply creating a hole in a line is not our goal when we're breaking a line. Our goal in breaking a line is to, at minimum, inflict heavy enough casualties that the enemy is forced to consolidate their line, ideally destroy entire portions of the enemy army, and at best, cause such a catastrophic collapse that the enemy surrenders outright. And this is really the goal of attacking into a line in a multiplayer game. It's not, can we win a battle? It's not, can I break through? It's, can we win the war by attacking this position? There's no other reason to attack a line. because the whole purpose of the line is to have a defensive position. So with that in mind, we want to give ourselves the best odds in any single battle. We've seen how we can stack wipe units very quickly in single battles, and we've also seen how unit cycling can drag out single battles indefinitely, right? How do we give ourselves the best possible advantage? Well, as I mentioned earlier, you need to go through and find where your best generals are. And whether it's offense or defense, you need to know where they are. And you can go into the military tab, find them. In this case, we've got a 4-4, 4 attack, 4 defense. Good morale boost, fantastic organization. This general is amazing, and I want him in every single battle he can be in. So I'm going to select that unit, and I'm going to press Control 1. That's going to be a general that, regardless of where I am, if I press 1 twice, it's going to move me to that general. So if I'm somewhere else on the map, I press 1-1. Now I've zoomed to that general, and I can move him around just like I would in, say, EU4. Now, because I want this general to be highly mobile, I don't necessarily want him to be on the front. And again, this gets to where we're setting up for war before actually going into war. So this is something you ideally want to do before you ever go to war, and that is find your generals, give them control assignments, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., and make sure you know where they are. If this were a real war, I would have this general in the back line because he could very quickly move into any battles I need him in. And the same goes on the defensive. If this were my 4 defense general, she's not, but as an example, I would have him, say, as my number 2 control group. So if the enemy were to attack anywhere on this line, I would have him in a central position and move him into battle as needed, just to give myself that extra edge on the defensive. And if you're in a multiplayer game, you can assume the enemy is going to be doing this as well. So that's the first thing, know where your generals are. Alright, number 2, realize that we have no idea what's behind this line. And there are ways to cheat and find out that information, but again, that's sort of beyond the scope of the game and poor sportsmanship, so I don't recommend doing that. But, you know, realistically, you have no idea what's going on back here. You know only what's presented to you. You can see there's a line, but we don't know how many extra troops are back here. And as such, we want to give ourselves the best advantages possible regardless of what's back there. Next thing we have to consider is picking targets. Ideally, you don't want to just throw your units into battle without some sort of plan, and as part of that plan, you need to realize what the enemy is likely to do as a response to any attacks that you make. We've also seen that heavily depleted units can get most of their strength back over the course of a single month. So simply depleting units is not going to necessarily win you the war. Even if you incur very heavy losses, it might be worth it if you can get a key stack wipe as a result. So with that in mind, let's consider the provinces you definitely will not be attacking into. Number 1, if you attack into either of these 2 provinces, there's only one way in and one way out, which means it's very easy to cut off. So this is not one we're going to be attacking into. Number 2, if we attack this relatively isolated province, we can come in from 2 directions, but we've got forests, so that's a -1, and we're also going to be crossing a river from either direction, so that's -2 total. So we're going to be taking much heavier losses in this province than we would be elsewhere, so also probably not going to be attacking here. We've got a similar issue here in Luxembourg. We're going to be taking more losses than we need to by virtue of attacking into the forest. In some cases we've got river crossings, in other cases we've got ones that appear to be safe, but if we were to attack in, we could get counterattacked and cut off. So, what does that leave us? Well, if we're only attacking into a single province, that leaves one and only one province here, and that's from Dunkirk. If we come across from Dunkirk, we can pile as many troops into this province as we want, and we can march east. There's no river crossing, there's no forest, there's no extra defensive bonus aside from the fort and whatever is conferred by technology. So this particular attack is the only completely safe attack if we're going from one province. But we're not limited to attacking from one province. So if we look at all the possible attacks, Dunkirk can attack this province. From this province we can attack these 2 provinces. This province can attack these 2 provinces. But if all 3 of these provinces are engaged, then none of these 3 provinces can be cut off. So in this way, one possible means of causing the enemy to collapse his line is to attack all 3 of these provinces simultaneously. I've moved a number of my armies from the back line over into support positions behind the front. Now why have I done this? Well, if you're playing against a player, if they're paying attention to what's going on, if you put all of your troops just immediately on the front, they're going to know exactly what you're doing, right? So if I were to pile all these troops onto this province and take my time, they would say, oh, all these troops are piling up in Dunkirk, so they're going to move their entire line over this way. What I'm doing in this case is I'm piling my troops behind the line in a position where they can very easily be moved to the front and into battle. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and get all of these units onto this one province, and yes, there's going to be some attrition, but the goal here is just to get them onto this province without being noticed. The goal here would be to get all of my troops consolidated onto one province and then move them in simultaneously. Now, I don't have military access with the Netherlands, and I'm not at war with the Netherlands, so unfortunately I can't demonstrate that. But basically, all these troops will now simultaneously move in. As we saw in the case of the Doomstack, the more firepower we can bring to bear simultaneously, the more damage we can do, and we could potentially stack wipe this unit before the enemy even notices we're there. So that's one way to do it. Now let's go back a bit. This is the only province that we can attack into that can't be cut off if we're only attacking from one point. But if we were to attack multiple points along this line simultaneously, we could have a multi-point attack, and it would go something like this. Attacking east from this province to engage into battle here, attacking east to engage into battle on this province, and attacking east to engage into battle on this province. So what's the purpose of this? If we attack from one province that has multiple enemy provinces bordering it, then as we're engaged in one battle, the enemy can counterattack and cut us off, right? Well, if we attack into those extra provinces that are bordering us, we keep the enemy from cutting us off. So the idea here is, again, we want to get our troops onto the border as quickly as possible without being noticed. So we get all these troops onto the border simultaneously. And once these troops are on the border, we would send these troops as individual stacks to attack the individual provinces here. Some pros and cons versus the single stack approach. The biggest benefit of this sort of approach is that if you catch the enemy off guard, you can win potentially all three of these battles before they've even noticed you're attacking. And depending on the enemy response, winning any one of these battles might be worth losing the other two, because you can always pull back. So as an example, if you win this battle and you've taken this province, you have pushed the line forward and you still have an effective line because you can still move around behind the line. And so it might be worth it even if you just win one battle and lose the other two. The biggest downside is that if the enemy is paying attention, and if they do have a robust backline and they can reinforce, you run the risk of losing all three battles. And if you don't have a robust backline of your own, then you might have a hard time reinforcing and reestablishing your line if you lose all three. So this is a situation where if the enemy were to reinforce these lines and if you were to lose all three, this is a situation where they might counterattack, cause you to incur substantial losses of your own. But again, that's something to consider. But in some cases this can work, and the more thinly spread a line is, the more likely this is to work. And especially in places like Russia, where the provinces can be quite large, if you attack multiple places at once, it can take months to reinforce some of those provinces depending on where the enemy has its troops. The more difficult it is for the enemy to reinforce, the more likely this is to work in your favor. But regardless, before you start the attack, you need to know that you have at least one good general in all of your attacking stacks. You want to make sure they're queued up before you go, but try and get them to the front and sneak them in before the enemy realizes what you're doing. And again, that's why I had them initially in the back line, move them to the front, and then simultaneously move them all in. A very extreme version of this strategy is often referred to as the Vincenio strategy in multiplayer games because he popularized it. That's to basically take your entire front and attack along the entire thing. Obviously, you need to have your units on the front before you do this, or at least close enough that they can reinforce. Ideally, you need to have a back line able to move in as needed to reinforce wherever you need it, and you still need to be able to cycle. The greatest benefit of this technique is that you can completely overwhelm the enemy just out of sheer confusion. If there are 10 different battles taking place at once, it's really hard to keep track of individual battles. And even ones that look like they're going well might not be going well, and individual dice rolls might turn them in your favor. The other benefit is that if you have all these different battles going, it's very hard to reinforce all of them simultaneously. So unless there's just a full second line back here, at least some of these battles are going to turn in your favor. Some of them obviously won't, but the goal here is to keep those units pinned down, so regardless of what happens, you're going to get at least some battles in your favor, ideally. The biggest downside of this approach is that if things don't go well, you've essentially played all your cards. At that point, if things go terribly wrong, the enemy can just counterattack and you basically lost. So this works well as a blitz strategy early in a war. If everything else has failed, you can do this as a last stand. But if it doesn't work, and if the enemy has a robust backline, you basically lost the war if things don't go in your favor. So I don't feel like I did a good job of explaining why we're trying to do these different things. I explained why you would attack into these different provinces, but not why you would want to attack in the first place, right? So aside from the larger overall goal, which is to collapse the enemy line, it's like, why is attacking this province a good idea, not just because of the fact that we can't be counterattacked? Well, let's say we attack this province and things don't go well, right? We started with a doom stack, and let's say we attack into this province and then the enemy notices. The enemy's got troops in the back line, and at least some of them are going to come over to deal with this invasion, right? And depending on the number that come over, it's possible we might do enough damage in this battle that, you know, it's going to be worth staying in regardless. So we can attack, we can see how the dice rolls are going, we can watch the damage numbers, and we can say, okay, we'll stay in as long as things are in our favor, and if they're not in our favor, we'll pull back. It's also a good idea to leave a stack behind from where you're attacking. So if we have a doom stack here moving in, we probably want to have a backline unit here in case they need to retreat. That way they can't just counterattack and beat us to the province, right? Really the goal here is we've identified a safe province to attack into. So if we're going to attack, let's attack the safe province and then see what we can do. So we can attack, we can see if things are going well, we can pull back if we need to. Let's say things go really well though. Let's say we move this doom stack in and we just completely destroy this unit, which is possible. What happens as a consequence of that? Well, we've moved our line up by one province, and yes, this is sort of a weird line, and to reinforce you have to go around the backside, but we still have access from the backside, so it is technically a safe line. The more important thing is that we've moved this unit up one province. In order to oppose our new line, the enemy has to put an additional unit on the line. So if we move up to this province, the enemy has to keep units here and here in order to keep us from pushing further. So if winning a battle will force the enemy to reposition its own line in a suboptimal way, then that's a really good attack for us. And let's say we were to do this on a one province basis, right? So we've moved up to this point and this province is now under our control, which means that this province is a perfectly safe attack to right here because we have a unit here, which means this one can't be cut off, right? So now we could do essentially the same thing here. We could pile units here, have a doom stack, attack east, and then see how much damage we can do to this province. If we need to, we can retreat back out, or we could keep the battle going if the dice rolls and if the damage numbers are in our favor. And again, the more troops you have filling out the combat with on your side, the more likely you're going to be able to continue doing damage while the other side is withering away, right? But once you attack, you know, the enemy is going to notice, they're going to pile in some troops of their own, so you're going to have to decide whether it's worth keeping a battle going or not. Let's look at the example of the 3-province attack. And again, none of these provinces in the back line can be cut off via counterattack. So this is perfectly safe as an attack. We're going to pile troops on the front. And you know, having 3 or 4 times as many troops as there are on the enemy line is a good idea. But really, if you can, you want to have doom stacks here attacking into each of these 3 provinces. So basically we're attacking into 3 provinces, and let's say the enemy notices instantly that you're doing this. Well, they've got units in the back line, and the first thing they're probably going to do is to throw 1 or more units into each of these battles to bolster their numbers. So the numbers are going to equalize pretty quickly. But from there, it's a question of, is our general better? How much damage are we doing? Are we doing more damage than the enemy? And if those questions are in your favor, then you keep the battles going. If things are not going in your favor, then you can pull your troops back, let them recover, and try again later. And remember, you've got a backline of your own, so your backline is going to need to move up to either support the attacks, or worst case scenario, if you do end up retreating from all 3 of these, you know, it's best to retreat into a province that already has a defending unit on it. So, you know, maintaining a line here behind the attack is a good idea, just in case they decide to counterattack. The enemy is going to be much less likely to counterattack if they see you've got a strong defensive position. And if you've got 30k still on this province, and you're additionally pulling back everything left from your attack, you know, you basically have a doom stack here once your units retreat, right? Because you had a doom stack going in, you took some losses, and then you pull it back. So you've still got a doom stack here. And is the enemy likely to counterattack into a doom stack? Well, probably not. So, you know, you can safely then partition it back out, let your units recover, and then see where you do from there. So let's say you perform this 3-province attack and, you know, it doesn't go well and you end up pulling back all 3 and you say, oh, terrible idea, you should never attack in Victoria 2, right? Well, that's not true because what you've done is you've tested the enemy defenses. Before you attacked, the only thing you knew was what the enemy was presenting to you. So you knew they had 30k stacks along the border, right? You had no idea what was back here, but if you attack, you can get some idea of how strong the enemy is based on the units that they move in to support, right? So depending on how late in a war it is or how depleted the enemy is, it's possible they might not be able to effectively repel you at all. Remember, before we attack, we really have no idea what's back here. We don't know what the troop positions are. We don't know if their generals are any good. I mean, it's possible you might be attacking into some terrible general. Remember earlier in one of the examples, we had an attacking general on the defense. We had a defending general on the offense. This is something that can happen just by chance. So it's possible you might be attacking into some garbage general and just completely destroy it. But again, you don't know until you try it. But also getting some information of the enemy's capabilities is itself useful. So yes, if you lose, you will lose some war score. If you stay in the battles longer than you need to, you can take heavy losses. I hope what I've conveyed here is that we're not simply throwing bodies at the enemy for the sake of throwing bodies at the enemy. We're putting ourselves in the best position possible to attack. We're giving ourselves a localized advantage, so we're going in with doom stacks, and we see the effect of doom stacks on single stacks. We make sure we've got the best general, we give ourselves every single advantage possible, and then we see what happens. But we acknowledge that there's a risk we're going to lose anyway. If things turn against us, we pull back. If things go well, we push forward, and given the reasons that we're attacking here in the first place, we know why we're attacking here and what we're going to do if we happen to push through. And as long as the battles remain in our favor, as long as we're doing more damage than the losses we're taking, it's reasonable to stay in the battles and keep them going. So even if the enemy is pulling in its reserves, if we're doing 4 times as much damage to the enemy, why not keep the battle going? But if things turn against us, there's no shame in pulling out. You've gotten some information, you see what the enemy's capable of, the enemy's been forced to deal with your invasion, and then you can plan your next steps accordingly. Now just real quick, I'm going to contrast this more tactical sort of consideration with something I've alluded to a few times, which is the never-ending battle. If you're familiar with World War I history, think of the Battle of Verdun. That's basically what we're trying to do, but in a Victoria II scenario, and for all the same reasons. And I'll be talking about this more in the next video because engaging in a never-ending battle is something you do for strategic reasons, not for tactical reasons. What we can look at is where would you want to initiate one of these attacks. The attacker chooses where the battles are going to take place, so if you are initiating one of these battles, you want to do it in a place where you're not taking a terrain penalty, places where you're not crossing a river. That's basically all the same considerations that we're looking at from the tactical standpoint, which is what's the optimum place to attack into if we want to win a single battle. Well, it's all the same considerations, except we want to keep this battle going indefinitely. So from the French position, probably the best province to attack into is right here. Not least of which because it can't be cut off from a counterattack. So let's say again, for just the sake of example, if we were to throw, say, 300k troops into Namur, the enemy would be reorganizing its troops to deal with it. But if for whatever reason the battle were to turn against us, that would be a situation where they would counterattack. And basically, if they were to attack this province behind on our line, it completely cuts off the attack. So if this stack loses the battle, they can't retreat and the whole stack gets wiped. Regardless of what our intention is in attacking, whether we're doing it for tactical reasons, whether we're testing the enemy position, whether we're trying to get stack wipes with doom stacks, whether we're trying to collapse the enemy line, really, regardless of what we're doing, we have to be mindful of the fact that the enemy can counterattack and cut us off if the enemy has alternative means to attack the position that we're attacking from. So now that we know the best ways to attack into an enemy line, we also know the best ways to defend our own line. As mentioned, very important to keep track of where your best generals are, and because I'm treating this line now as a fully defensive line, I've got my best general here right in the middle. He's control group 1, so I press 1 twice, I can zoom to him. And basically, anytime battle gets initiated, I'm just going to throw him into battle. So we can, if we want to, go through and manually remove every single general from an army. And if we remove the generals, then we have all these generals in our pool, and we can select manually which general is going to go where. It's very tedious to do this. You can do it. And obviously, if you're doing this, you want to save yourself as much prestige as possible, so you want to do this while you're not at war, but it's something you can do. And what's the purpose of doing this? I showed you already an example where we have a general in a centralized position that can be moved out wherever he's needed, right? We can already see where our weakest defensive positions are, and we can plan for attacks there. We saw that in the case of France attacking north, this was a perfectly safe place to do it. But the reverse is not true, because if the NGF attacks here, we can counterattack and cut off anyone that's in this province, right? So this is actually a good defensive position for us. Now, if there's a strait with the UK, You might want to have a good defensive general here regardless, just because you want to keep the UK from marching across into France. But let's just ignore that for now. What we're looking at is a war with NGF Netherlands. So we're looking for those provinces that are most likely to be attacked. And we can see a fantastic place for the enemy to attack us right here. And that's because any number of units can funnel through this one province, and we have no way to counterattack. The only provinces that we can attack if we're performing a counterattack are these two. So from the north, this is a fantastic place to attack, which means I want to have a really good defense here. So as a general, if I have no one here, I want to make sure I've got a really good defensive general here. So this might be a good place for a +3 or a +4. Unfortunately, generals in Victoria 2 are sorted by prestige, which is not that meaningful, so it might take you a little while to try and find that one particular general you know you have, but you've lost track of where he is. But basically what we're doing in this case is we want to make sure we have at least some sort of reasonable defense in these provinces that are good targets for the enemy, whether or not the enemy decides to make use of them. But it's also a really good idea to have our floating generals in the back, ones that we can assign to control groups where regardless of where the enemy attacks, we can move these generals in and make sure we've got the best defense possible. In this case, I'm fighting against AI NGF, and the AI has decided to attack into the forest. And I already have a fairly good defensive general here, but again, one of the key reasons that we're using the line at all is so we can cycle safely behind it. So once the attack has been initiated, this isn't exactly a doom stack, but it certainly outnumbers our stack. So the first thing I'm going to do as soon as I know this battle's taken place is I'm going to move additional units in to support it. And you can always cycle out troops, so throwing in way more troops than you really need is fine. And it might encourage the enemy to retreat from the battle anyway. So you can see once that battle started, I've got an additional 120k troops moving in, and it's going to be a few days before they get there. They're going to be there in plenty of time to reinforce this battle, and there's no way the enemy's going to defeat us that quickly. But as these units are shifting over, we see that our backline in the east has been diminished a bit, so you know we can move our other units over, and really it's a question of which units are we going to shift over where. The enemy has initiated another battle here. Unfortunately, this is one I was using as a demonstration of how to remove generals, so there's no general there right now, but let's go ahead and move some of these troops over. And really we're just cycling as needed, so I'm going to move my 4 defense general in here actually. And cycle out the ones that are damaged. Again, that's the general idea. Same basic concept anytime we're cycling stacks. And again, the AI has no real concept of how cycling works, so you know you can use this to your advantage and win pretty much any battle. Because the AI is just going to come in with 1 or 2 stacks, they're going to attack what it thinks is the best target, and then you just come in and completely destroy them. But let's set up a situation here which I think might be fairly representative of a real-world situation. So we've got our defensive position. And we're going to just let the enemy come in and attack us. Alright, so this 42 stack is attacking the 29 here. If this were a real player, obviously this is a terrible place to attack into, but you know, for the sake of demonstration it kind of works. So how does a counterattack work? Well, if this enemy attacks into Saarbrücken, what we're trying to do is prevent that enemy from retreating, right? Obviously, if this were all of Germany, the enemy could retreat to the east, but I don't think they have military access, given that they're just marching around to the north. But what we're going to do is we're going to make sure, again, we want to find our good attack generals. So our control group 1 right here. He's a little bit weak. We could move this onto another unit, but really it doesn't matter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare for the counterattack. We've baited the enemy has attacked, and you know, on the surface this looks like a good attack, right? But what we're actually doing is we're going to move in behind the enemy and trap him here. So we're going to bolster our line. We're going to make sure that we have someone on the line at all times, and we can use this fairly depleted unit. We can let this unit recover on the line itself. And as this unit is recovering, we're going to move in behind the unit. At the same time, we're also going to cycle on the battle that's taking place. So at this point, we've cut off the unit. The only way this enemy is going to be able to retreat is if the enemy attacks into this province and wins the battle there before this unit dies. So really we can just take our time and destroy this unit at our leisure. Again, the most important thing that we're doing here is cutting off the enemy. If there were a battle taking place here, that would be fine. Really what we're doing is we're preventing the enemy from retreating. So there we have it, 42,000 troops wiped by virtue of those troops not being able to retreat to the back line. So this demonstrates one of the most useful situations in which you can launch a counterattack, which is if the enemy is attacking you, and if that enemy that's attacking you can be cut off by a counterattack into the province that it is attacking from, then you can attempt to use this to your advantage to destroy the enemy army. Something else to keep in mind though is that counterattacks can chain with each other. So let's say the enemy attacks here, so you attack here to cut off the enemy. Well, because we don't have direct access to our backline to this province, it means that the enemy can cut us off by attacking right here. Now, if the enemy is engaged in battle here, that means we can cut off this enemy by attacking right here. So, you know, it kind of chains. And because this was a fantastic province to attack into, the enemy can cut off this stack by attacking right here. So, you know, you get this sort of chain effect. Usually it doesn't happen to quite this extent, but it's not uncommon for 2 or 3 battles to take place simultaneously as people try and cut each other off. And the thing you have to consider is, I have to keep this battle going long enough to kill this unit. If this battle ends before this unit dies, then I'm going to get retreated and this unit can retreat, which defeats the entire purpose of launching this counterattack, right? So don't counterattack unless you can destroy the army that you're trying to cut off. And the same thing goes in reverse. So if I counterattack to this point, and if I've got a large army here, the enemy shouldn't counterattack here unless it has a sufficient force that can wipe out the army that I'm attacking with. But if you launch this sort of counterattack, you should assume that the enemy is going to throw its best generals and pretty much everything it has into that position. Because if it doesn't very quickly push you back from this position, then the enemy risks losing the units that it used in its own attack. So repelling counterattacks is highest priority. And also, if you're performing a counterattack, you still need to have a robust backline that you can cycle from. So you can't just move your entire line into the counterattack, right? If you are launching a counterattack, it's all the same considerations we had as when we were initiating the attacks in the west, which is we need to have our good generals in position, we need to make sure we still got a functioning line behind the counterattack, we need to make sure we've got overwhelming numbers, and that's especially true if you're launching a counterattack because the counterattacks can get cut off themselves. A couple more things when it comes to line defense. Just as we have no idea what's taking place back here, where the enemies are, how many there are, how many stacks they have in reserve, whether they're full strength or not, you know, where the good generals are, we don't have this information on the enemy, and assuming the enemy isn't cheating, they don't have that information on us either. So looking like you have a strong line can be as effective as actually having a strong line. So just because you don't have a robust backline, you know, if the enemy attacks you, they're going to find out very quickly that there's nothing back there. But if your defenses are convincing, you might prevent the enemy from attacking into you at all. Another thing, keeping a depleted unit on the front is kind of an invitation to get attacked there. So, you know, if you got like a half-strength unit, definitely don't take up a position right on the front line. And again, this is where cycling comes in, and you can have your more depleted units further back and then cycle them forward and so on. So we've already identified that this is probably one of the most likely places we're going to get invaded, just because it's so safe for the enemy to do that. You know, even if they lose the battle, it's still perfectly safe for them. So we can plan for that, and if you identify one of these really weak points, it's, you know, why not just put an extra unit there? Our supply limit is 60 at this stage of the game, so we can have 130 stack at each of these other provinces, and we can, of course, use our backline to reinforce as needed. But there's no reason we can't have this extra bit of protection here on the front if we know we've got a position that's so weak. So this is going to be a place where I want to make sure to have one of my better defensive generals. So from the NGF perspective, the NGF knows that this is the weakest province and that this is the weakest front. So the NGF is probably going to shift more of its backline units over in this area. And, you know, if it's using 30 stacks, there's no reason it's limited to just 130 stack on this province. So, you know, bump it to 60. Make sure you've got a good defensive general there. And, you know, these same considerations work regardless of who you're playing. You can look at your line. You can identify the weak points. Once you've identified the weak points, plan accordingly. But now let's consider a situation where a full frontal attack can work very effectively. Special situation that rarely happens in multiplayer. Let's talk about the Blitzkrieg. The general objectives of a Blitzkrieg are to move as quickly as possible into enemy territory, set up strong defensive positions while simultaneously cutting off large chunks of enemy territory and dispatching any units that might be in that territory after you've set up positions. So a few things we have to consider. Number one is this is not something you typically do in a multiplayer game. You're generally going to have a good idea of who's hostile to you. And, you know, backstabs can happen, but even when they happen, they're usually not completely out of the blue. So you're going to have some warning, and because of that, you're very rarely going to have a situation where you can just walk completely unopposed into enemy territory. But against AI just move their units all over the place. They're haphazard. They have no idea what they're doing. So against an AI, Blitzkrieg works incredibly well, so much so that, you know, it's very unfair, to be honest. But, you know, it's just one additional way that you can completely mop the floor with any AI that you're fighting against. So how do you set up for a Blitzkrieg? Well, you want to have all your invading stacks in a convenient position. If you're doing this against a player, then you probably want to have your units off the front line so they won't know where you're coming from. It just takes a few days to walk through a province, so if this line were one province back, you know, it'd be delayed a couple of days, but otherwise same effect, right? So the idea is we want to have these units march in as quickly as possible and set up new defensive positions. So what I've done is I moved the NGF's units off the front line. This is now an AI, and the NGF demobilized and is now remobilizing. So this would be the situation if we were fighting against an AI. You can see that if we go into recruitment map mode, we can see exactly where their units are going to appear as they're mobilizing. Now, unfortunately for the NGF, any recruited troops that appear while an enemy army is occupying that province gets stack wiped instantly. So these are our top priority, actually. And as we're going to get our units onto these provinces to not necessarily occupy them, but at least kill off any new units that spawn. At the same time, we're going to send other units into enemy territory to set up a strong defensive line. The same considerations go into effect for any time you're creating a line. So we want to have as few provinces as possible in strong defensive positions, and we want to have a safe area behind the line where we can reorganize and occupy at our leisure. So if we're looking at the west, clearly we've got a strong defensive position in the forest. We've got another strong defensive position here. We have a single province bridging the two, so clearly we're going to be moving there. We've got one large province that cuts off this area to the south, and then if we were to go to Weimar, or if we go to Weimar, we cut off these two provinces, or we could just stay in the forest, which would be the better defensive position. Really, we could send troops to all of these positions. If we wanted, we could send a separate contingent to Berlin, so if we're lucky, we might get to the capital before they're able to do anything. And let's just play this out real quick and see what happens. So the AI is going to be moving around and trying to respond. Also, as we're moving in, I'm going to keep recruitment map mode on, so you'll see that right now I can only see these two provinces because that's where I have vision. I can see there's recruitments taking place here. I don't know exactly where the recruitments are taking place elsewhere, but as my units move in, those will be revealed, and as they're revealed, I'll be preferentially moving my units onto those provinces because they're much higher priority. So right here, these two are already moving that way. Let's see, this guy was going to Weimar. Let's redirect this guy to this particular province to kill any units that spawn there. Alright, let's see, another province where units are going to be appearing. Let's get one of these Berlin units up here to Dusseldorf, so that will be a nice unit to stack wipe with. So we can redirect units as we go along, but really the keys are, can we get to these positions quicker than the enemy, and can we at least start occupying all these provinces where enemies are going to be appearing before the enemy actually appears. So we can see this strong defensive province is actually one that's going to be spawning some units, so fantastic. We're going to kill those as they appear. We've got one unit that's definitely on the wrong side here, so he's going to get stack wiped, and this guy going to Berlin, he's going to be a bit cut off. So at this point I'm going to redirect him. Going to be quite a few popping up in Magdeburg, so I'll go ahead and move him there. You can see as we go through, just re-establishing the lines as needed. But you get kind of the general idea here. We've got these strong defensive positions. We now set ourselves up to occupy this whole area at our leisure. Of course, depending on the size of the nation you're doing this to and how far you're willing to advance into the country is going to determine how effectively this will work for you. But just be aware that in multiplayer games it tends to not work as well because players are much less likely to let you just march into their country like this. And you know, part of this is because I intentionally moved the NGF's armies away, but you know, now it's AI and they'll start coming back. But basically, this works really well against AI, and especially if you're micromanaging your unit positions. So we'll see these occupations are almost done. So, you know, ideally occupy them before anyone spawns at all. But that's the general idea. So move in, set up positions, and then occupy behind at your leisure. And anyone that gets cut off behind, you know, stack wipe them just at your leisure. So let's consider a situation that might actually happen in multiplayer. And this is a sort of common baiting that can take place, especially if nothing has happened on a front. Someone might try this just as a way to entice a battle that's more favorable. So let's say this particular unit on the front just decides to wander off. We don't know where this unit went, but he's no longer on the front. And because we're not allied with the Netherlands, we can't see what's going on back here, right? There's this very enticing opening in the front, right? And if we were the AI, we would just pour all of our units into that province, right? What's actually going on here is the enemy is setting up behind this province, and they probably got a gigantic force back here, and really all they're waiting for is for you to move onto that province, and the second you do that, you're going to get collapsed on. All of these units come and attack you, and at the same time, you can't move back, because anyone that moves into Namur has to go through this one province, which means that if we move units into Namur, that unit gets attacked, and this province also gets attacked, and therefore this province gets surrounded. Their line has the potential to move out, and basically anyone that moves in here is dead. So if you see an opening like this in a multiplayer game, enter at your own risk, but realize that what's probably happening is you're being baited, and if you move there, and if they notice you moving there, you're very likely to get surrounded and die. Another thing that happens, and I believe Creamlord was the one that popularized this, and it works especially well in large provinces like central Russia, ones that take a substantial amount of time to move back and forth. And basically it goes like this. You're watching the line and nothing's happening, no one's moving. But all of a sudden you see that the enemy on the front is moving back. And you think, oh, okay, well, they're moving the line back, right? Because they're consolidating their line, so they're in a weak position. They're trying to reform their line in a stronger position, so I'm going to move in and take that province. But what you don't realize is what's happening on the backside that you don't see. So in a case like this, what might be happening, so this unit is moving backwards, but at the same time, another unit is moving forwards, and you don't see that unit that's moving forwards. So you look, you see, oh, this unit's going to be out on the 5th of September. So I'm going to time my movement very carefully and make sure that I get there on the 6th. So the idea is, you know, if I move today, we both there on the 5th, and there's potential for a battle, and I might lose because I'm attacking, right? But if we run the clock for one day, we can now look and, oh, okay, I'm going to get there one day after this unit is out, right? Well, you don't realize that this other unit is also going to arrive here on the 5th. But what's really taking place here is you're being baited into attacking a defensive position. That is, if you move in, you think, oh, no one's going to be here, but in fact, someone is going to be here, and then you attack, you can get surrounded and stack wiped. And again, the reason this works better in larger provinces because it takes longer to move between these provinces. So the possibility of reinforcing or retreating is greatly diminished, and you're likely to take heavier losses in cases like that. So just be aware, just because you see a line is moving backwards doesn't necessarily mean it's actually moving backwards. And that's especially true if the rest of the line isn't moving. Next thing we're going to look at are naval invasions, which are, in my opinion, probably the single most difficult thing to pull off properly in Victoria 2. The first of many problems when it comes to naval invasions is that any troops that take part in the naval invasion can't also be doing something else. So that means I need to pull my backline units, my support units, and use them for the invasion. Now, if my support units are taking part in the invasion, that means they're not here on the front. So if the enemy uses this opportunity to attack me, I'm going to have a really difficult time cycling and supporting those units because all my extra units are off elsewhere. And this is why in multiplayer, oftentimes because there are multiple people on each side of a war, different people will give themselves different tasks. So like one person might be completely responsible for doing nothing but maintaining the front, you know, with a few extra units from the others, whereas the other players might be doing something completely different. You don't want to overwhelm yourself by managing more theaters than you have to, right? So if you can in a multiplayer game, you want to sort of partition this sort of thing out. You have one person that does nothing but the naval invasion, You have one person that is responsible for making sure no one is coming across the border. But in this case, it's just me as France. These units aren't really sorted out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull these 4 units off the front. Clearly this wouldn't work in an actual game, but anyway, this is just for demonstration purposes. Alright, so that's the first and biggest problem, is that units are no longer available to do other things. We're going to load up these troops, and here we see the second problem. Unlike EU4 where you can just click a button to embark units, within Victoria 2 you have to do this on a per unit basis, and you have to click this button within the individual unit windows. So if you want to have these 4 units with these 4 generals, then you have to go into every single one of these units and separately embark them like so. Which you can do, but it does take some time. We can see that this Navy can carry 40 brigades. Currently it's carrying 40 brigades, so we can now embark it like so. Now in multiplayer, naval invasions take a lot of planning because a lot of things can go wrong, so people don't just naval invade all over the place. So first off, we need to disembark, and we can see that to get to this province it's going to take us 12 days, which isn't a huge amount of time, but my last attempt to show this didn't quite work out, so let's record this again. People aren't typically looking for naval invasions because they're relatively rare in multiplayer, and when they do happen they tend to be large, and people will usually devote their entire army to dealing with it because it's critical regardless of whether it's a win or a loss. So let's say, as an example, we're going to do a naval landing on this one province, and that province has a unit on it. Let's go ahead and run the clock. So we can see in this case there's no amphibious assault penalty, although there is a dig-in bonus. So, you know, in an individual battle we stand to do quite well. But here's the first of several problems. So we talked about unit cycling quite a bit, and the enemy can obviously cycle its troops, and they're going to do so. The problem is, if you are isolated on just a single province attacking like this, you know, you might get lucky and win the battle right off the bat. It's possible. But the bigger problem is you can't cycle. So you might do a lot of damage and then retreat and come back, but in the meantime the enemy is able to fully replenish itself because they're properly cycling and in home territory, right? So for this reason, an invasion with a small number of troops is just not feasible. It's not going to work. I mean, even if you inflict heavy losses, eventually that defensive is going to turn against you. And again, if I were playing NGF properly here, I'd be moving in my strongest defensive generals. I'd be reorganizing all of my stacks. Here I've just got some garbage troops I threw in, but basically NGF is going to be coming to deal with you very quickly, and this is just a tiny portion of your army, right? So this is a case where you tried to attack onto enemy territory. You see that having a strong offensive general is key, and basically in this case we're doing a doom stack, but now the enemy is coming to deal with us, so one doom stack deserves another, and this will eventually start turning around, especially if NGF plays properly and more of these troops come back. So let's assume this doesn't happen. Let's just assume that none of these troops are here. I'm going to pull these off, retreat. Alright, so that battle went great, right? But now here's the problem. We saw the downsides of having a group of troops in home territory, right? And I talked about if you have these troops here and none of these troops are here, eventually that German line is going to surround us and then pick us off one by one, right? Well, the same thing is going to happen here. We're taking heavy losses thanks to attrition, and because we're in enemy territory, even if we occupy this province, we're not going to be reinforcing as quickly as the enemy. So, best case scenario, we're going to try and spread out in a hurry and set up something resembling a defensive line within enemy territory. Now, there's some problems with this. Obviously, our individual units on the sides can get picked off, but really the bigger problem is that we just can't cycle effectively. And let's even assume we went and got another 120k troops and just dumped them all right here. Well, the enemy attacks this. If we converge all of our troops on one province, we run the risk of being surrounded and stack wiped. If we don't converge our troops, then the individual stacks can be targeted and taken out. And we have some general idea of how much strength we recovered when we were in home territory. Let's watch what happens when we're in enemy territory. Little anticlimactic. So that 20k stack is still a 20k stack. This 25 gained 1k. These, I'm not sure if they moved at all, but basically our replenishment was nothing in enemy territory. Let's go ahead and run it one more month because now we're starting to occupy these provinces and we'll see what happens. We got 24, we'll call that 21, 24, 26. 24, 21, 24, 26. Alright, so 24 became 27, 21 became 24.5, and these two are pretty well replenished. Basically, you can see that compared to home territory, we're not replenishing anywhere near as fast, right? And that's even with the vast majority of our troops having plenty of pops to support them. You can see that because they're white and yellow here. So even if we cycle perfectly, we're still going to be taking heavier losses than the enemy. So what are the keys to a successful naval invasion? Well, number one, and I think perhaps most obvious, is naval superiority. Because if you can't safely move your troops back and forth, and especially if you can't safely recover your troops if things don't go well, then you're going to lose a large part of your army, and or the naval invasion is just going to be a non-starter. So that's the first thing, is make sure that you have naval superiority at least in the area. Number two, if possible, trying to invade more isolated areas. So in the case of the UK, invading Britain, probably not the best idea, because you can assume that's going to be well defended. But if you've got naval superiority by some miracle and you can cut off Ireland, then you can, at your convenience, occupy the whole thing. And really this just relies on there being no one in that area. If I were at war with Scandinavia, I would drop my navy right here in this area and then at my leisure occupy Denmark. Just some very quick and obvious examples of the sorts of things that you can do with a naval invasion. But let's say you want to go for the mainland. You want to go for the core area of an enemy. How do you do it? Well, ideally you want to get as far away from their army as possible. So this, in the case of NGF, is probably the worst place to invade, because NGF can very quickly move its army back and forth. It can move its entire army back, obliterate this small contingent here, and then move it back to the front, and it's like nothing's changed. So ideally, if I were invading NGF, I would want to do so way over here somewhere. And ideally somewhere there's a choke point that I can easily reinforce and cycle behind. So again, the purpose of a line is to keep everything behind it safe, and the same consideration needs to be made if you're doing a naval invasion. So if I were hell-bent on occupying this area, I would definitely try and occupy Kiel and everything north of it, because Kiel would be my last stand choke point, and everything north of it would be a place where I could cycle and let my troops recover and reinforce and pull back and retreat as needed. And I feel like some of this is obvious, but it's really hard to convey just how difficult it is to pull off correctly. And even in the case of a nation like UK trying to naval invade France or even Spain, the home court advantage is so extreme that the UK is going to have a hard time even if it has naval superiority, and even if it is devoting pretty much its entire military to that one purpose. If you're playing against competent players, it is probably one of the most difficult things you can do. Now let's look at Italy, because I think Italy is an interesting example. You'll often see cases in multiplayer games where a not very confident Italy will just line their entire border with troops. Because even if Italy has their entire coastline defended, there are ways to break through and launch a successful naval invasion. It's not easy, and the losses will be extreme, but you can do it. And here's how. Well, first off, the same considerations as before. Pick off those areas that are more isolated first, and those areas that are farthest from the main army. So if the main Italian army is in mainland Italy, that means that your best bet, at least initially, is to invade Sardinia. And as we saw, there are benefits to using a doomstack approach. That is, we can take our entire army and invade a single province. Because this province is plains, there's not going to be any additional bonuses to that defensive position, so obviously this is going to be the preferable place to invade. And then if you win this battle, you can very quickly turn south. You keep a single 3K stack here, which means Italy can't retreat, and then eventually, assuming you have enough troops, you win this battle. Obviously there's a defensive position here, but if you win the battle, then you win the island, and then you can occupy it, and then so on. Now there's an alternative here. If we want to prevent any possibility of Italy retreating and getting any reinforcements at all, we can actually attack both of these provinces simultaneously. So if our invasion force is large enough, we can do this. Remember, you can't retreat onto a province with an active battle. So if we win either of these provinces, then those units just vanish. They can't reinforce, they can't retreat, and they're gone. So if we attack both these provinces and we win this one, we can split off a 3K stack just to stand on that province, move all the rest of those units down, and then we can attack this one along with the troops that are already there. So you can see in this case, keeping an army on Sardinia is a little bit of a liability for Italy, and many Italy players just won't keep any units out here at all, because why risk losing those units to a substantially larger force that's going to be coming anyway, right? This is the sort of thing anyone with a coastline has to consider, when it comes to where you're going to place your units, but let's look at the case of Sicily. So Sicily is a bit higher value than Sardinia, and as such, a lot of Italy players are going to pile some troops down here. So let's look at a potential naval invasion of Sicily. Obviously you need to have naval superiority because you don't want Italy to just march across and reinforce, right? So that's the first thing you're going to do, is make sure that these units are completely isolated. Now, once you've done that, you've got all the same considerations that you have here. Let's say there's 60k troops on each of these 3 provinces. If you were to, as an example, put all your eggs in one basket, you attack this province. Well, there's 180k troops here, right? So these units can be moved in, these units can be moved out, there's unit cycling taking place. It's going to be difficult to win any single battle. Number 1, because you don't have the benefits of cycling if you're performing a naval invasion. Number 2, because of the defensive position. So this is yet another case where you might be better off performing multiple invasions at once. And this is a case where, if you're able to coordinate, you might invade all 3 of these provinces simultaneously. None of these 3 provinces can be retreated into any other province. You've already blockaded this area, so you can't just march across. And if you win any of these 3 battles, you're guaranteed to win the other 2 by virtue of those extra units you've freed up. So if you've got 60k here, let's say you move 120k onto that 60k. If you win the battle, whatever is left of that 60k just vanishes, and whatever is left of your 120k, you split off 3k to keep it on this province, and then you move the rest into either of those 2, and then you win the next one, and then so on. So that's how you can perform a naval invasion. But now let's look at the mainland. Let's consider, again, what the purpose of a line is to keep the area behind the line safe. So any line along the coast ideally has to be reinforceable by the area inside the line, right? So here in the north, we've got this huge inside area that we're going to call safe. But here in the south, we don't have that situation. There are, in fact, several provinces that can be cut off entirely. So a naval invasion of mainland Italy should not be taking place in this area, because this is the area where effective cycling can take place. But down here, we've got all the same problems that we had in this salient in Russia, is that if some of these provinces get attacked, it's very difficult to reinforce around them, and in some cases impossible. So let's say we launched a naval invasion of Potenza here. That means these 2 provinces are cut off. So we might start a battle here that we're intending to lose, just so we can actually march in and kill these 2 units, right? So now we've started our invasion. We've got a front. It's a 1 province front, and from here we can continue further north. If we have this province secured, then an invasion into Bari cuts off this province. So this is yet another situation where a multi-front invasion can cut off multiple provinces. And if we were to attack these 3 simultaneously, then these 2 get cut off. And it's yet another situation where we can work our way up 1 province at a time by cutting off everything further down. So what is the actual safe front for Italy? Well, if we're looking at naval invasions, it goes something like this, and from here it just cuts across, because the only way to reinforce Gaeta is to go through the line. So anything south of Rome is a sort of a liability. Now, a lot of Italy players will defend this area, but if the enemy really wanted to, they could, with relative ease, cut off everything to the south here by attacking key provinces along the way. So something to keep in mind when it comes to naval invasions. Losses will be high, but it is something that can be done. Of course, naval invading a player who's able to cycle their troops effectively is going to be substantially more difficult. And if Italy were an AI, you could very easily cut off whole chunks of Italy and just occupy it at your leisure. You've got any number of choke points that you can cut off. So yeah, yet another reason why fighting the AI is incredibly easy. Let's talk about navies. Navies are probably one of the most misunderstood aspects of Victoria 2, and with good reason, because there's hardly any explanation at all, and much of what happens doesn't really make any sense. Let's just conduct a few quick experiments here. So first off, I'm going to send out a single frigate to fight the Germans, and we can put an admiral on this if we want. As with land-based combat, generals have a variety of stats. The most important of these is the attack or defense statistic. So before you send your navies into battle, you want to make sure that you've got a good attack or defense general. And it's kind of weird when you think about it when it comes to navies, but if you're the one engaging, your attack stat is the important one. If you're the one defending, your defense stat. Although realistically, you know, it's back and forth, but who cares? Anyway, we're going to send this Navy into combat and see what happens. In on the 9th, and it got stack wiped instantly. Send in 1 ship, stack wiped instantly. Let's send in 2 ships. So, fortunately, you have to click behind the Dutch fleet here, as annoying as that is. So, again, unlike EU4, where if you have over 10 times as many troops as the enemy, you will get instantly stack wiped. That's not what's happening here. So we can start an actual battle with just under 10% of the enemy's number of ships. But let's go ahead and run the battle. We see the battle from the attacking side, that's the French side. And we see each of these 2 ships has 1 objective at the moment. So our first ship of the 2 is approaching a target, which is a man-of-war. Our second ship is approaching a different man-of-war. But right now these ships are just moving towards each other. Unlike land-based combat, retreating from naval battles is very different. Probably the biggest difference is that it's not based on the amount of time that elapses, but rather how close your ships are to each other. So your ships have to get within range of each other before you can retreat them. The more important thing that I want to point out here is that each ship is engaging 1 other ship. So each of our attacking ships is engaging 1 enemy ship, but if we look at the other side, several of the enemy ships are engaging the same 2 attacking ships. So that means that if these are engaging each other simultaneously, we're taking a lot more damage than the enemy is by virtue of having fewer ships in the battle. We can see that already we're taking some damage here as a result of being engaged. So as far as our ships are concerned, we're still approaching, but we're already taking hits from the enemy. So right now our ships are already retreating. We might get blown out of the water before we make it out, but we'll see what happens. See, as far as we're concerned, we're doing nothing but retreating, but the enemy is still chasing us and trying to kill us. So this is one way that naval battles are very different from land-based battles. And you see we're retreating even though, as far as the game is concerned, we're not yet allowed to retreat. So again, another situation where naval battles are very strange. But anyway, let's go ahead and let this play out. Alright, so we didn't lose any ships. Obviously our ships are limping back to port. They are very weak, so they did take some damage, but neither of them were destroyed. So what's the important take-home message here? Well, it's that individual ships operate independently. So as long as you have a ship engaged in combat, or at least capable of engaging in combat, that ship is going to continue seeking enemy ships, attacking them as possible, but it's also going to be subject to attack by enemy ships. So as a general rule, there is a huge advantage in numbers. Alright, so some more specific examples. So we're just going to send this 24K stack. We're going to send a few frigates with them. We just want to make sure these clippers last for a little while at least. And, you know, it doesn't really matter what happens to these frigates, but we just want to make sure this fleet isn't instantly destroyed, okay? Alright, so embarking. We'll move that particular fleet out. Alright, the fleet is out. We'll start these units moving back to land, and you'll see they'll arrive on the 1st of March. We've got some number of ships here. We can assume that they'll be around for at least a little while, but let's go ahead and move this German fleet back onto this navy and start a battle and watch what happens as we go along. So we're starting out with 24K troops, and hopefully, if we're lucky, at least some of these clippers will get destroyed, but we got until the 1st to see what happens. 21st, that navy will be in, and here we go. Each individual ship is conducting its own operations, and even the transports are engaging with each other. But we can see from the numbers that we are losing some ships on the defending side. But even as this battle was taking place, our units were disembarking. Alright, so this German fleet's being split. We're going to have 2 frigates and 10 transports left in the Straits of Dover, and in the meantime we're going to move these 13 transports back. We'll split this down a bit. So make sure we've got enough room, and we'll see what happens. Alright, so there you have it. Even though we have enough room for these units on the ship, if naval combat is taking place, you cannot move your units onto the ship. So unlike EU4, where you can move a single suicide ship out to engage an enemy navy, and thereby trap units and stack wipe those that are low morale. Doesn't quite work that way in Victoria 2. It's similar, but not quite the same. Basically, if the Navy is in combat, you can't walk onto it. Even though you can try to walk onto it, but you know, when it actually comes time to move onto the ship, you won't move onto the ship. Which means that, as we saw, moving a single ship out to engage the enemy just got wiped instantly, so that wouldn't be sufficient in order to keep this unit from moving onto the ship. But if we can keep the battle going for a little while, we can prevent the enemy from retreating. So something to keep in mind if you're trying to counteract a naval invasion. So the last thing I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to show you, but hopefully I can describe it adequately. If you mouse over the different types of ships that you can build, you'll see that they have different max speeds, different attack ratings, different hull ratings, firing range, supply weight. Now basically the supply weight determines how many of these ships you can build before you go over your supply limit. And your naval supply limit depends in most mods on the number and level of your naval bases, and oftentimes on whether those naval bases are cored or overseas, and also whether they are in territories or in states. Basically, the more coastal areas you have and the more high-level naval bases you build, the higher your naval supply limit is going to be, usually. Now, you can go over your naval supply limit, but it is going to cost you a lot of extra money in supplies, and you know, you can do it if you want to. If you got the money to support it, by all means, go way over if you like. But just realize that not everyone can do that, and you know, your mileage may vary. So if we're looking at our naval supply limit, and if we mouse over any of these different ships, we'll see that all of them have a supply weight. And that supply weight basically means if we build the ship, that's how much of our supply limit it's going to take up. So a monitor takes 6, whereas a cruiser takes 20, so ideally we'd want a cruiser to be 3 times as good as a monitor, right? Well, if we look at all the different stats that we have here, we've got attack, hull, firing range, etc., max speed. And what that all comes down to is if we're in battle, each ship is acting independently. We have ships that are approaching, we have ships that are disengaged, we have some that are seeking targets. So basically, we got ships that are looking around, and depending on their speed, their max range, all these other stats, that's going to determine how quickly they can find new targets to blow up, right? So in general, ships with longer firing ranges are better. Ships with more attack are obviously better. And ships with more hull will take more hits before they blow up, so those tend to be better. But as we saw in the first example, the number of ships also has a huge impact. So there's a lot of debate within multiplayer groups as to what the ideal naval composition is, and I'm not sure there is an ideal naval composition, but it's a trade-off. On the one side, you've got cannon fodder, and cannon fodder isn't completely useless because all the cannon fodder is soaking up the damage that would otherwise be hitting your more valuable ships. On the flip side, more powerful ships, especially the Dreadnought, they're going to do a lot of damage, they're going to be fast, they're going to hit things as soon as they see them, but they take up so much of your supply limit that you can't have very many of them. You see, our supply weight in this case is 95. But you know, depending on which nation you're playing, you might only be able to support 20 or 30 Dreadnoughts, and that might be your entire navy. So there are things that you as a player have to consider, and I don't think there's a right answer. I'll tell you some things that people try, and you can decide whether you want to do it yourself. The first thing I'll say is that, in general, there's no real difference between light and heavy ships. It all comes down to the individual stats. And I say that because of testing that I've done with other players, and you can see that on my channel. I'm pretty sure that's a PDoc short, where we did basically all battleships versus all dreadnoughts, and we just played it out over and over to see what would happen. And basically it was perfectly even. We had the same amount of naval supply, we threw them into battle, and it all came down to the dice rolls. So I don't think that the light versus heavy ships really makes a difference, whether you have cruisers or not. But lighter ships do tend to take less supply weight, so mixing in some light ships will soak up some damage that would otherwise be directed towards your heavy ships. So this is where we get to the extreme other end of the spectrum. On the one side, you've got building heavy ships, the heaviest ones you can afford. They take a lot of resources, they cost a lot of money. They have the potential to bankrupt you depending on the mod you're playing. On the other side, we have frigates, and there is a concept in multiplayer called frigate spam. And the idea is that if we're in battle, every single one of our ships acts autonomously. We have large ships that blow up everything they see the moment they see them, but on the other side, we've got tiny ships that are like pea shooters. So every one of these frigates does hardly any damage at all. They are slow, they can barely evade, their range is low, but if you get a lot of these ships together, they have the potential to do a lot of damage. The key here is knowing how many of these things you have to build. Now, in a late game multiplayer Victoria 2 game, people might build like 6,000 frigates and throw them into battle, and it will completely lag the game because, again, every single one of these ships is acting independently, which means you got 6,000 frigates here, and they're all searching for targets, they're all shooting peas at the enemy, they're trying to destroy the dreadnoughts, and, you know, maybe every once in a while you get lucky and you actually hit one and destroy it. And, you know, as soon as the dreadnought sees a frigate, it's destroyed. But if you have thousands of frigates, and if you're lucky, you have the potential to destroy a more advanced navy. So often in multiplayer, if a nation isn't able to support a real navy, frigate spam isn't perfect, but, you know, it's better than nothing. But more importantly, you have the benefit of combined arms, so to speak. So if I'm France, and if I have a good navy, and if my ally Spain has a garbage navy, but they have 4,000 frigates, if I go into battle, into a naval battle with the UK, I can throw my semi-functional navy in, they can throw their garbage navy in, but because we've got all these extra ships soaking up damage, we have the potential to defeat a more powerful navy where either one of us would have lost on our own. So something to consider, and even if it doesn't work, it's something that's kind of hilarious, so you might try it anyway. But it's just something to keep in mind. You don't have to have the most advanced, largest navy possible, but having something is better than nothing. And even if the purpose of that navy is just to throw it out so you can, you know, if someone is trying to evacuate some troops that from a failed naval invasion, at least you can keep them busy long enough to kill the troops. So this video is probably going to be incredibly long, but sorry about that. That's just the way Victoria 2 is. Again, there are a lot of specific things I've left out, but I think that's a pretty good practical approach to things you can do. Last thing I'll say, though, there is a common saying in multiplayer, which is once you've played multiplayer, you can't really go back to single player. And the reason for that is, you know, it takes time as a new player to get exposed to these different techniques. You know, this isn't stuff that you typically pick up just on your own. It's stuff you pick up through experience and especially through your failed attempts. And even when it comes to relatively simple concepts like how do you cycle, you know, that's something that newer players have some trouble with, and even some experienced players. But once you have a fairly solid grasp of these concepts, you can just walk all over the AI regardless of who you're playing. You know, there are some exceptions. I mean, if you're Belgium trying to fight France day one, it might not work out for you. But, you know, if you're playing a relatively decent-sized country, it is fairly easy to bait the AI into doing things that a player would never do. It's easy to surround enemy units and stack wipe them one after another. It's very easy to doom stack where you need to wipe them out one after another. Let's say you're playing Austria and maybe you put a 12k stack in the mountains and the AI is like, oh look, an easy target. Well, you've got all these other stacks behind it because you've got a functional line, so you just pile in behind it, you surround it, you've stack wiped it. You know, it's just so easy to mop the floor with the AI that once you've taken part in multiplayer, it's kind of hard to stay engaged with it. So this is why most people that do multiplayer don't really go back to single player. That's also why I'm not too interested in doing single-player campaigns of Victoria 2, and really haven't been since I started playing multiplayer. And we'll talk about this more in the next video when we get to the strategies. So whether that's versus the AI, whether that's versus players, whether that's co-op, or, you know, even if you're the one against the world Gurren situation, we'll talk about all that. And so yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks for watching and have a good one.